Hey guys, tonight we're doing something a little grimy. We're heading back to the Middle Ages. Not the polished, romanticised version with knights jousting in sun-drenched fields, but the gritty, muddy, utterly desperate version where your next meal might be, well, your own shoe. That's right, this is one of those stories where you probably won't survive, but don't let that stop you from enjoying the trip. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. No pressure. Drop your city and time in the comments too. I'm always curious where and when you all are tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. We begin in the thick of a winter that just won't quit. Snow piles up outside a crumbling stone hut. Wind howls through the thatch roof, and you, my unfortunate traveller, haven't eaten in 3 days. You can't go hunting, there's nothing left. Your stored grains are long gone, even the rats have given up and moved on to more promising hovels. So what do? You eye your boots. They're old, stiff, and smell like the inside of a sheep's armpit, but they're made of leather. And leather, believe it or not, is technically edible. Boiling leather was a survival trick for the truly desperate. Soldiers under siege, prisoners, peasants, abandoned during harsh winters. If they had nothing else, they'd scrape off any mould or dirt, boil the leather down for hours, sometimes days, and try to chew through the rubbery, gluey mess that emerged. It wasn't pleasant. In fact, it was kind of like eating a wet belt dipped in bone broth, but it could keep you alive a little longer. Here's the trick though. Not all leather is created equal. Medieval folks knew that tanned leather using certain methods, especially vegetable tanning, was safer to eat. Leather treated with lime or other chemicals was avoided unless you really didn't care about what happened to your kidneys. Boiling leather was also a way to soften armour, known as cuir bouilli, but that was for battle. This was survival. And desperate stomachs didn't care much for nuance. You gather some snow, melt it down over the fire you barely managed to spark that morning, and dunk your boot in the pot. You scrape the metal pot with a shard of iron, used more than cooked in, and slowly stir, hoping to soften the hide into something swallowable. The result smells indescribably bad, but you chew anyway. Your jaw hurts from the effort. Your stomach rebels. But hey, calories are calories. Here's your historical fact for tonight. During the 1315-1317 Great Famine in Europe, widespread starvation forced people to eat just about anything. Cats, dogs, tree bark, and yes, leather. Chroniclers tell of parents boiling belts and shoe soles for their children. Some even resorted to eating the leather, bindings of books. That's how bad things got. There were stories, maybe exaggerated, maybe not, of people digging up freshly buried corpses for food. Yeah, welcome to dinner in the Dark Ages. But here's a fringe detail for your nightmares. Not all boiled leather came from shoes. In some cases, families kept pieces of old saddles, shields, and even strips of decorative leather from church doors. Anything that could be boiled down into a kind of primitive gelatin was fair game. Even leather scabbards, if you had one from a broken sword, might end up in the stew. Now, was it healthy? Of course not. There's an open scholarly debate about how digestible boiled leather actually is. Some argue that the proteins in tanned leather are so denatured and chemically altered, they offer minimal nutritional value. Others suggest that the collagen content could at least provide short-term energy. If not sustenance, then survival padding. Either way, no one recommends trying this today unless your version of meal prep involves self-harm. But for you, sitting next to that fire, clutching a cup of boot broth, there's no time for debate. You drink, you chew, you swallow. And when the pain in your belly eases just enough for you to lay back on the dirt floor, you dream of roast goose and honey cakes, and wonder if tomorrow will bring a better option, or at least a different shoe. The fire crackles softly. Outside, the wind wails like a mourning ghost, slipping through the cracks in the wall and stroking your face with icy fingers. You curl up, cloak wrapped tight, the taste of wet leather still clinging to your teeth, and wonder if anyone else out there is doing the same thing tonight. Chances are they are. Starvation was never a solitary experience in the Middle Ages. Misery, you see, had company, and that company, usually hungry. There's something deeply unsettling, but also kind of fascinating about how resourceful people were when pressed to their limit. And while modern preppers might stock MREs, canned beans and protein bars, Few of them have considered the noble survival art of shoe broth. Maybe it's time to rethink your bug-out bag. Might want to toss in some vegetable-tanned leather scraps, just in case. The cold doesn't let up. In fact, the snow outside has begun to freeze into a brittle crust, crunching like broken bones under any foot brave or foolish enough to walk across it. You're not walking anywhere today. Your legs ache, your fingers are swollen and red, and the wind feels like it's trying to peel the skin off your cheeks. So you hunker down, pulling your patched-up cloak tighter around your shoulders, and shift your focus from food to shelter. Because hunger might kill you in a week, but exposure can take you out overnight. This is where you start to appreciate the brilliance of something modern preppers rarely consider. Smoke holes and earth homes, humble, drafty, and unimpressive to look at, these homes were the unsung heroes of medieval survival. Your little hut, half buried into the side of a hill and covered in turf, is a living example of how people fought back against a climate that frankly didn't care about their survival odds. The basic idea is simple. Dig partway into the earth to use the ground's natural insulation. In winter, that earth traps heat. In summer, it stays cool. Then you build walls out of wood, stone, or whatever you have, and cap it all with a thatched roof. Or better yet, more turf. It's not glamorous. You don't have drywall or central heating. You don't even have glass windows, just a cloth flap, maybe a wooden shutter if you're fancy. But you're warmer than you'd be in any exposed wooden shack above ground. And then there's the smoke hole. No chimney here. Just a little hole at the top of the roof, often off-centre to catch wind and draw smoke out of the room. It's rudimentary ventilation, but it works. Mostly. The fire on your hearth smoulders low, just enough to keep frost from forming on your eyebrows. You've propped a large flat stone behind it to reflect some heat back toward you, and you've positioned your sleeping area at the far end of the room, where the warmth pools in the stagnant air. Clever, right? You're not the first to do it. Medieval peasants learned how to create microclimates inside their homes, using nothing but body heat, fire, and smart design. Sleeping close together, even with animals, was common, not because they were unsanitary, but because the heat of a cow is better than no heat at all. Your sheep bleats softly in the corner, tucked into its own straw-lined enclosure. The warmth it gives off is a godsend. So is the wool you'll shear from it, assuming both of you survive until spring. Here's your historical fact. In many regions of northern and eastern Europe, partially subterranean homes, called pit houses, or Grubenhäuser in German, were widespread throughout the early medieval period. These structures were often just a few feet below the surface, sometimes with a wooden or wattle floor suspended above the ground. Their design trapped warmth and shielded residents from wind, making them surprisingly efficient in cold climates. They weren't status symbols, but they were lifesavers. Now, here's something a bit quirkier. Smoke holes weren't just practical, they were spiritual. Some medieval folk believed that the smoke hole was where souls left the home when someone died. Blocking the hole during a death was thought to trap the spirit inside, which, depending on your belief system, was either a good or very, very bad idea. On cold nights, when the smoke curled lazily through the gloom and you swore you saw faces in it, you'd understand why that belief stuck around. There's an open scholarly debate about just how widespread and standardised these earth home techniques were. Some archaeologists argue that what we now interpret as pit houses might have served multiple purposes: storage, workshops, even animal pens, not just homes. Others are confident that they were indeed residential spaces, adapted over time to suit family needs. Either way, the underlying principle is clear: get low, get warm, and stay alive. You shift your weight on the packed dirt floor. The cold still seeps in, but not as aggressively as it might. The hearth fire flickers, barely more than a handful of glowing coals, and you toss on another chunk of wood. Not too much. You need it to last the night. Outside, wolves howl in the distance. You're not particularly worried, though. They don't come this close to fire, and they're probably struggling just as much as you are. No one's thriving out there. The walls of your shelter are patched with daub, a mix of straw, animal dung and clay, smeared between wooden slats to seal gaps. It stinks when wet, but right now it's dry and solid, like hardened fudge on the inside of your home. It blocks the wind and holds in heat. You brush a finger across the surface, it flakes a little. might need repairs come spring. Your feet, wrapped in cloth and pushed into straw-filled leather boots, are finally starting to regain feeling. You consider pulling them off to massage your toes, but then you remember what happened the last time you exposed skin to the air in here. Numbness that lasted hours. Instead, you press your hands into your armpits and rock gently, waiting for the worst of the chill to pass. You wonder how anyone ever built these homes to begin with. How did they know this would work? Necessity, probably. Trial and error. And a whole lot of dead ends, literally. But once someone figured out that earth and dung and thatch could keep the cold at bay, the method spread fast. It wasn't about aesthetics. It was about survival. It still is. And here's something that might blow your mind. The modern world has circled back to this. In eco-architecture and passive house design, people are now rediscovering the principles of medieval pit houses, earth insulation, natural ventilation, and radiant heating. Fancy terminology for stuff peasants figured out with a stick and a spade. So tonight, as you lay on a bed of straw, wrapped in a cloak that smells like smoke and goat hair, remember, you're not just surviving. You're sleeping in a piece of architectural wisdom that predates your thermostat by centuries. And despite the cold, the wind, and the threat of wolves, you're warmer than you should be. Thanks to a little hole in the roof and a whole lot of dirt. You wake up to the sound of dripping. Not the soothing musical kind you might get in a warm cave somewhere in a fantasy novel, but the slow, cold kind that means your roof is leaking. Again. A small puddle has formed near the fire pit, and the straw in your bedding is already starting to go damp. You sigh, sit up, and glance overhead at the patch of thatch that's surrendered to last night's sleet. Yeah, this place is barely holding it together, but here's the thing, your humble hut is still standing, and that's because of a medieval building trick so solid it's outlasted kingdoms, dynasties, and probably more than a few noble families, Wattle and daub. Now, you may not be familiar with the term, but wattle and daub is one of the oldest and most reliable ways to build a wall with almost nothing. You take a framework of woven wooden sticks, the wattle, and slap a thick mixture of mud, straw, and animal dung over it. The daub. That's it. That's the secret. The result? A surprisingly durable, weather-resistant, and semi-insulating wall that can last for centuries if properly maintained. It doesn't get more low-tech than this, and somehow it works. You crawl to the wall of your shelter and run your hand along its bumpy surface. Still cool to the touch, slightly crumbly at the edges, but solid. You remember helping patch it together last summer when the northern wall started to sag. It was a whole village affair. Men chopping hazel rods for weaving, kids stomping in clay like it was a festival, and the older women expertly mixing in just the right amount of cow dung to make it all stick like glue. Not glamorous, sure, but effective? Absolutely. Here's your historical fact. Wattle and daub construction dates back over 6,000 years and was used extensively through the medieval period. From humble peasant homes to high-end Tudor buildings, this method showed up everywhere because it was cheap, quick, and surprisingly tough. It could flex with the seasons, absorb impact, and even survive minor fires. In fact, during parts of the Middle Ages, it was legally required in certain townships for new buildings because it was considered safer than timber. And now the quirky bit. In some regions, the daub wasn't just functional, it was also decorative. Medieval folks would paint over it with lime wash, often adding pigments to tint the walls pink, yellow, or even pale blue. Why? Maybe just for joy. Or maybe because if you're going to live inside a wall made of poop and twigs, it might as well be cheerful. There's a fascinating scholarly debate over just how sophisticated these wattle and daub homes actually were. Some archaeologists argue that we underestimate medieval peasants' architectural skill, pointing to how some walls included insulation layers, moisture barriers, and clever ventilation tricks. Others claim we're romanticising poverty, that many of these structures were just barely cobbled together and would collapse in a decade. But the fact remains, some of these walls are still standing today. Go figure. You grab a flat stone and start patching the leaky spot near the fire pit, pressing a chunk of frozen daub back into the exposed frame. Your fingers sting from the cold, but the motions are familiar, almost meditative. You think about how this building style was passed down not through books or blueprints, but through repetition, generation after generation watching, learning, copying. It's weirdly comforting in a world where everything feels temporary, to live inside something that's lasted longer than most people's memories. And then your eyes drift upward again. That roof. Oh, that beautiful disaster of a roof. It's thatched, of course, a chaotic weave of reed, straw, and, if we're being honest, a few pieces of string and hopeful prayers. Modern preppers usually don't give thatching much thought. Too messy, too primitive. But medieval folks knew what they were doing. A well-laid thatch roof with a good pitch and tight bundles could last 20 years or more. It repelled rain, insulated against heat and cold, and even gave you a place to stash things, which brings us to your secret pantry. You duck low and crawl into the narrow crawl space just under the thatch, careful not to disturb the mice or the spider colony you're trying not to think about. Tucked behind a ridgepole is a small clay pot sealed with wax. Inside, dried apples, your emergency stash. Probably won't win any flavour contest, but in winter, it's basically treasure. You nibble one slowly, letting the leathery fruit soften on your tongue. Not exactly medieval trail mix, but it'll do. Here's a lesser-known fact. Many thatched roofs doubled as storage. People would tuck dried herbs, garlic, cured meat, even tools up there. It was dry, somewhat secure, and out of reach from dogs, pigs, and very determined toddlers. Of course, this also meant your roof occasionally dropped surprises onto your head, like beetles, or a desiccated sprig of rosemary. Charming. There's also a peculiar belief from the period that spirits and fairies could live in the thatch. People would sometimes weave charms or trinkets into the roofline to appease these unseen residents. If you ever wondered why old houses have weird symbols etched into beams or coins sealed into the ceiling, there's your answer. Protection, luck, and maybe a bit of superstition tossed into the construction mix. As you climb back down from the rafters and settle in by the fire again, there's a quiet satisfaction in knowing your home is more than just a pile of mud and sticks. It's a carefully engineered system, designed to use what's around you, keep out what isn't, and store just enough to get you through the long, frozen nights. And the best part? It's all biodegradable. You could walk away tomorrow, and in a few seasons the land would reclaim it entirely. Zero footprint. Medieval peasants were doing sustainable living before it was cool, so while modern preppers may obsess over concrete bunkers and steel shipping containers, here you are, surviving in a house that cost nothing but sweat, creativity, and a very strong stomach for livestock smell. And despite the cold and the mice and the occasional roof leak, there's a strange peace here, because every inch of your shelter was built with your hands, or the hands of someone who taught you how to survive with almost nothing. Your hands still smell faintly of smoke, earth, and the daub you pressed into the wall earlier, but that's not what's really bothering you. What's bothering you is the jug in the corner, the one with the dark brown stain around the rim and the wooden lid that doesn't quite fit. You've been avoiding it for days now, but it's full, has to be emptied. Because believe it or not, even waste has its purpose out here, and you're about to put it to work. Human waste in the Middle Ages wasn't just gross, it was useful. You might not be thrilled about this, but tonight we're going to talk about pee. Not in a joking, medieval toilet humour way, okay, maybe a little, but seriously, as a survival tool. Because if you're trying to stay alive without running water, bleach or even soap, urine is going to become weirdly essential. You lift the jug carefully, trying not to spill any, and carry it outside to the designated pit. It's not glamorous, but it's manageable. Just a shallow hole with a few stones around it, located downwind and out of sight. You dump the contents and cover it with a bit of ash. Sanitation in the Middle Ages was hit or miss, but you've learned a few tricks. Still, you don't toss the jug back into the hut just yet. You need it again soon, because stale urine, after about a week of fermenting, turns into ammonia. And that, strangely enough, is one of the most powerful cleaning and curing agents medieval people had. Here's your historical fact. Medieval tanners used aged urine to help strip hair and fat from animal hides. The ammonia helped soften the skin, making it easier to work with. Likewise, fullers, people who cleaned and thickened wool, used urine to cleanse cloth. It broke down oils and helped set dyes. In other words, before soap became common, people literally used pee to clean things. It wasn't pleasant, but it worked. You've got a rabbit hide drying near the fire, and the skin's still stiff from yesterday's half-hearted stretching, so you set up a bowl, pour in some of the older, more pungent urine, and lay the hide in to soak. The smell hits you like a punch to the face. You gag a little, but you keep going, because this is just what you do out here. Use everything, waste nothing. It's not just leather. Some medieval people even used urine for medicinal purposes. Now hold on, I'm not suggesting you try this, but historical accounts describe urine being applied to wounds, insect stings, even used in poultices. The logic, if you squint hard enough, kind of tracks. Ammonia has antiseptic properties, and when you don't have antibiotics or even clean water, you get creative, or desperate, or both. Here's your quirky fringe fact. There was actually a medieval job called the piss collector. These were usually poor men who went door to door gathering chamber pot waste, especially in towns, where cloth industries were booming. The collected urine was then sold to fullers and tanners for processing. Imagine that as your career path. Good morning, just here for your liquid gold. It paid terribly, it smelled worse, but it was a living. There's an ongoing scholarly debate about how widespread urine-based treatments actually were. Some argue that they were more symbolic or ritualistic than genuinely medical. Others point to detailed recipes in medieval manuscripts and argue that, yes, they were absolutely used as disinfectants, however gross that might seem to us now. And let's be honest, medieval medicine wasn't exactly operating with a high success rate either way. Once your hide has soaked long enough, you pull it out with a stick, wring it with your gloved hands, yes, you have gloves, you're not a total savage, and hang it back up near the fire. The smell might cling to your nostrils for hours, but the result is worth it. Softer leather that you can turn into warm liners for your boots or a patch for your ever-thinning cloak. That's survival, right there. One disgusting, totally necessary step at a time. Back inside, you use a small amount of the less fermented urine mixed with the ashes to scrub down your cooking pot. It cuts through the grease left behind from last night's choux soup and leaves the metal gleaming. Well, relatively gleaming. Then you rinse it with melted snow and set it aside. You'd kill for some actual soap, but for now, this weird chemistry experiment will have to do. And here's a surprising upside. Your hut doesn't reek. Not really. The smoke from the hearth masks most odours, and the thatch overhead breathes just enough to vent out the worst of it. Besides, your nose has adapted. You'd be surprised how quickly the human body accepts new, olfactory realities. Out here, you stop judging smells and start translating them. Is it decay? Is it mould? Is something burning? Your nose becomes your survival radar, and today it's telling you that things are, remarkably, under control. You sit back and stretch your aching arms, glancing around your space. The rabbit hide drips quietly. The fire crackles. The jug sits empty, ready for another week of fermentation. And despite how truly bizarre it sounds, you feel a little pride. You've taken what most people would toss away in horror and turned it into a tool. That's what survival looked like in the medieval world. No part of life was disposable, not even waste. So the next time someone brags about their freeze-dried survival rations and solar-powered water filters, just smile to yourself. Because you know how to tan a hide with pee, scrub a pan with ash and ammonia, and stay alive in a world where nothing comes easy. Modern preppers might turn up their noses, but medieval survivors, they'd nod in respect. There's a rhythm to survival out here, a dull, repetitive drumbeat of chores, cold, hunger, and hope. You wake up, tend. The fire, patch the roof, stretch the hides, collect snow to melt, and try to keep the rats out of your food stores. But there's one part of the routine that still feels a little thrilling, even sacred, checking the pantry. Not the shelves in your hut, those are mostly empty, but the hidden stash. The one buried deep in the thatched eaves and tucked beneath floorboards. The medieval secret to making food last, and more importantly, making sure no one else finds it. In a world without locks, alarms, or motion sensor lights, protecting your food meant hiding it. Literally. You crawl to the far side of your hut, roll back the mat of straw, and lift a flat stone that seems totally ordinary, unless you knew exactly where to look. Beneath it, nestled in a pit lined with cool earth and clay, are a few sealed jars and a sack of dried beans. The clay keeps things cool even in summer, and in the dead of the winter like now, it's a little fridge buried in the floor. This, right here, is how peasants outsmarted both nature and their neighbours. because hunger doesn't make people polite. During famines or hard winters, theft skyrocketed. Your neighbours might be kind in autumn, but come February they'd break into your home for a crust of bread. So instead of risking your entire winter store, you buried part of it. Roofs, floor pits, even within the walls, anywhere you could reach without drawing attention. Here's your historical fact. Medieval people often used pantries in the most literal sense. Panis, meaning bread, was stored in cool, secure places. Sometimes that meant a root cellar, but more often it meant caches, small hidden stores of food carefully concealed from both pests and people. It wasn't paranoia, it was policy. Everyone did it. You run your fingers over the cool clay jug. Inside is a thick paste of crushed grains, fat, and herbs. Something like a medieval energy bar if energy bars were grey and smelled faintly of onions. You take a small pinch and press it between your tongue and the roof of your mouth. It's gritty, oily, and weirdly satisfying. The fat hasn't gone rancid thanks to the cold and a thick layer of beeswax over the top. This was your grandmother's recipe, passed down from a time when survival was always plan A. And here's something quirky you wouldn't expect. Thatched roofs didn't just store herbs or meat. In some regions, people suspended baskets from the ridge beams, filled with dried bread, berries, or smoked fish. The heat rising from the hearth below kept mould away, while the airflow through the thatch stopped things from getting too damp. Of course, that meant climbing into the rafters now and then to rotate your supplies and shoo off the occasional curious raven. You're pretty sure you're still pulling feathers out of last month's sausage. But it wasn't all passive storage. You remember last summer's trick, burying bread. Not fresh bread, obviously. That would just rot. No. You took small round loaves, baked them until they were dry and rock hard, and then stored them in sealed clay jars under a layer of ash. The loaves are so tough now they could double as weapons, but they're still edible, if soaked in broth long enough. Medieval hardtack, basically. There's a debate among food historians about whether these preserved breads were a common strategy, or more of a regional oddity. Some say it was normal practice in Northern Europe. Others argue it's more myth than method. But here in your village, it was taught like gospel. Bury the bread, keep the rats guessing. And speaking of rats, yeah, they're a problem. You've set traps, but they're clever, especially the older ones. Which brings you to another not-so-fun part of medieval survival. Pest protein. Let's just say, if you caught a rat and it wasn't visibly diseased, you didn't always throw it out. You'd clean it, skin it, roast it over a fire and pretend it was rabbit. The line between desperation and dinner got real blurry, real fast. It's the drying that matters. You slice the meat thin and hang it high above the fire, letting the smoke cure it slowly. Salt helps, if you have it. Which these days you don't. You ran out last month. But the smoke alone keeps the meat from spoiling, at least for a few weeks. Long enough to get through this stretch of winter, assuming you don't have visitors. You check your secret stash again. There's one small jar of pickled turnips left. You hesitate. You could eat it now, or wait another week. The acid smell stings your nose even through the wax seal. But it's a comfort just to know it's there. You tuck it back in and cover the pit again, rolling the stone in place with practiced precision. No one would ever know. Here's another odd little fact. Some medieval homes had hollowed-out beams used as hiding spots, not just for food, sometimes for coins, knives, or tiny religious tokens. The beams were hollowed with chisels and resealed with wax or resin. During times of war or bandit raids, entire families relied on these small, sneaky spots to preserve the only things keeping them alive. You head back to your fire, heart a little lighter knowing your hidden pantry is intact. You've outlasted another week. Your fingers smell like dried onion and smoke. Your clothes are stiff with grease from the hide work, but you're fed. And in the medieval world, that's a win. Modern preppers talk about redundancy, have backups and backups for your backups. Medieval peasants lived that way by necessity. They didn't trust a single store of food. They spread it out, stashed it, camouflaged it. Not because they were paranoid, but because they were hungry. Every single winter. So tonight, as you wrap yourself in your cloak and let the fire die low, you remember where every single secret jar, sack, and scrap of dried meat is buried. You could draw a map in your sleep, but you won't. Because in the Middle Ages, the first rule of survival is this: if you want to eat tomorrow, never tell anyone where your food is. You wake up to the smell of something rich, earthy, not exactly pleasant, but familiar and, dare you say it, comforting. You sniff the air again. Yeah, that's dung. Warm, fresh dung. Which means your animals are still alive, and in the medieval world that's fantastic news. Because tonight, we're diving into something few modern preppers ever want to talk about: the beautiful, functional and often gross world of medieval permaculture. Or as it's better known around here, fish ponds and dung gardens. You shuffle out of your hut, boots crunching over frost-covered straw, and head for the far edge of your plot where the pit lies. Your compost heap, if we're going to get fancy with terms. To the untrained eye, it looks like a pile of rot, muck and regret. But to you, it's black gold. This is where you've been tossing animal waste, ashes, spoiled food, crushed bones, and the occasional pile of hair for the last 3 seasons. In a few weeks, once the frost thaws and the spring sun remembers how to shine, this foul heap will be the source of life for your garden. Because out here, you don't just grow food, you build tiny interlocking ecosystems, low-tech, self-sustaining survival machines that recycle everything, waste nothing, and thrive under neglect. That's right. Medieval peasants were doing permaculture long before anyone slapped a trendy label on it. The garden lies dormant now, blanketed in snow. But in your mind, you see the layout clear as day. Root vegetables up front, turnips, carrots and leeks, because they're hardy and hide underground where frost can't get them easily. Behind them, the hotbed, where you mixed fresh dung and straw in layers beneath the soil to warm the seedlings from below. Yeah, that's right. Heated garden beds. No wires, no tech, just poop and planning. Here's your historical fact. Medieval monasteries and manors often used layered compost techniques and livestock integrated gardening long before the concept of soil science existed. The monks especially were masters of this, developing rotating systems where garden beds, livestock pens, and waste pits worked in cycles to enrich each other. The results were shockingly productive, even during lean years. You dig a gloved hand into the compost pile and flip a layer, watching steam curl upward into the morning air. The warmth from decomposition is real, and if you ever get truly desperate, you could even sleep next to it for a bit of heat. Smelly, yes, but warm. Next, you head down the narrow frozen path behind your hut to check on the pond. It's shallow, maybe waist-deep, ringed with stones and fed by a trickle of runoff from the hillside. You chip a hole in the ice with your spade and lean over the edge. No movement now, it's winter, but you know what's down there. Carp. Fat, lazy, slightly muddy-tasting carp. And before you scoff, consider this. That pond is a protein bank. Quiet, low maintenance, and reliable. In medieval times, fish ponds weren't just features of wealthy estates. Some villages maintained communal ponds, carefully managed to provide a year-round protein source. The monks again led the way, especially since they couldn't eat meat on many religious holidays. So they developed aquaculture methods that most modern preppers wouldn't even dream of. Polyculture ponds with multiple species, controlled breeding, even winter harvesting techniques. Here's your quirky fringe fact. Some medieval fish ponds were engineered with flow channels and sediment traps, literal water filters, to keep fish healthy. In a few cases, archaeological digs have revealed sluice gates and stone weirs that allowed peasants to selectively drain ponds and harvest fish without emptying them completely. These weren't just muddy holes in the ground, they were carefully designed food systems. Of course, it wasn't just fish. You remember the dung gardens the older villagers talked about? The practice of planting shallow-rooted crops directly in compost mounds. The idea was simple. Dump manure in a pile, let it rest a few weeks, then stick seeds straight into the side of it. Pumpkin, squash, beans, all of them love the heat and nutrients. It sounds unthinkable today, planting food in literal excrement, but it worked. And once the plants were growing, they kept the flies and smell at bay. Sort of. There's debate among historians about how widespread these dung gardens were. Some believe they were mostly rural, practical solutions used by peasant families with more manure than land. Others argue they were emergency tactics, used in times of famine or desperation, when no one could afford to be squeamish. Either way, the results were edible, and that's what mattered. You glance around your small holding now, the snow softening everything into gentle mounds. The pond, the compost pile, the dead still garden. None of it looks like much, but come spring, it'll explode into life, and not by accident. You'll turn the compost, warm the soil, redirect runoff, and dig irrigation channels by hand. It'll be dirty, exhausting, and totally worth it. You think about how modern preppers focus so much on tools, water filters, generators, night vision goggles. Out here you've got a shovel, a pile of poop and some scrawny fish. And somehow that's enough, maybe even better, because it's quiet, renewable, and you don't have to worry about batteries dying in the middle of the night. Before heading back inside, you scatter some dried nettle leaves over the compost pile. It speeds decomposition and, weirdly, cuts the smell a bit. Another trick passed down from someone long dead. That's how most survival knowledge works out here. Learned the hard way, buried in memory, and occasionally written on scraps of bone or parchment. Inside the hut you warm your fingers by the fire and glance at the garden tools lined up near the door. Bent spades, cracked rakes, a trowel that's more rust than metal. They're ugly but reliable, just like everything else around you, and when the thaw comes, you'll use them to coax food from filth and life from the dead earth, like always. So, next time someone tells you they're going to ride out the apocalypse in a bunker full of canned chili and tactical gear, ask them this. Do you know how to build a fish pond with no cement, or grow leeks in composted pig poop? Because out here that's not a joke, that's the plan. The wind starts up again around dusk, pushing through the gaps in the door with that low, moaning tone that always makes you feel like the house itself is whispering. You pull your cloak tighter around your shoulders, not just for warmth, but for what it represents. Because this isn't just any cloak. This one's wool-lined, waxed on the outside, and patched so many times it looks like a map of your whole life. It's been a blanket, a door curtain, a ground cover, and more than once, the only shelter between you and a freezing night. In fact, medieval folks didn't just wear their clothing, they weaponized it. Tonight we're talking about the most overlooked piece of survival gear out there, your cloak. Or, as it might be better known, your tent, your shield, and occasionally your armour. You sit by the fire and spread the cloak across your lap, checking the seams. Still holding. You stitched most of it yourself, with coarse wool thread made from your own sheep. The outer layer is waxed linen, water-resistant, not waterproof, but enough to turn rain into runnels instead of soaking you to the bone. And beneath that, a double lining of felted wool, thick and heavy, almost like wearing a rug. Not stylish, not breathable, but warm as a hearth and more useful than half the tools in your kit. Medieval survival was all about layering utility into everything. A cloak wasn't just fashion. It was infrastructure. Your bedroll, cloak, your raincoat, cloak, a makeshift tent, tie it to a tree and crawl underneath. You've done it more than once, hunched beneath the edge of a pine with the cloak pegged down by rocks and a fire struggling to stay lit beside you. Cozy? No. Functional? Absolutely. Here's your historical fact. Cloaks in the medieval period were often designed with a semicircular cut, allowing them to drape fully over the shoulders and fall across the body like a mobile sleeping bag. Some even had built-in hoods or detachable panels. Wealthier folk lined them with fur or padded them with feathers, but even peasants knew the trick of doubling up layers and sealing the fabric with animal fat or beeswax for better water resistance. You stand and sling the cloak around your shoulders, fastening it with a simple wooden toggle. It's heavy, almost burdensome, but that's part of the charm. The weight traps heat and keeps the fabric from flapping in high wind. You could sit still in a blizzard under this thing and walk away frostbitten but alive, which you've done. Once. You don't recommend it. As you move toward the door, you reach for the hood, a wide, loose affair that pulls over your head like a tunnel. When it's up, you can barely see your feet, but your ears stay warm, and your face is shielded from sleet and smoke. The design is simple. Drape and fold, no real tailoring, just enough to turn your own breath into a heater. You can even tuck your hands into the inner folds when gloves run out or get soaked. Here's a strange fringe fact. Some medieval cloaks included thin layers of hardened leather sewn into the lining, especially among travellers or mercenaries. These functioned like primitive body armour, enough to turn a glancing blow or deflect a knife. Not exactly chainmail, but better than bare skin. There's even evidence that shepherds in particularly wild regions reinforced their cloaks with bark or bone slats, just in case the wolves got ideas. There's still debate among historians about just how multifunctional these garments were. Some argue that the surviving cloaks we study are ceremonial or elite versions, not reflective of what the average traveller wore. Others suggest that what we've lost in surviving fabric samples is the very thing we should be studying, the everyday utility gear of peasants and labourers who turned garments into tools because they didn't have a choice. You remember last spring, when the rains came fast and the creek near your hut flooded. You wrapped the cloak around your bundle of food and tools, tied it off with cord and used it as a floating sack. It half sank, but your flour survived. So did the knife. The cloak dried 2 days later by the fire, stiffer than a plank but still usable. If it ever truly gives out, you're not replacing it. You're bearing it with honours. Out on the path now, you wrap the cloak tight against your body, feeling how the wool traps your body heat and seals out the worst of the cold. Your breath clouds the air in little ghosts. You bend, pick up some kindling and notice something else. The cloak has pockets, hidden ones, stitched into the interior folds, accessible only when you reach across your chest or slide your hand behind your back. You've stored everything in there. Charms, jerky, flint, even coins you didn't want to bury. It's like a medieval cargo jacket without the branding. As the wind picks up and snow starts to drift across the path, you think about the preppers who spend thousands on layered outdoor wear, Gore-Tex, thermal insulation, zippered vents, and here you are, wrapped in felted wool and waxed linen, still dry, still warm, and best of all, it's completely silent. No crinkling, no nylon noise to give you away if you're hunting, or hiding. Back at the hut, you shake off the snow and hang the cloak near the fire, careful not to scorch the hem. You kneel beside it, adjusting the fold so it dries evenly. The smell is comfortingly musty. Wood smoke, old lanolin, a hint of mint from last summer's field. You rub your hands along the seams, checking for damage. One tear at the edge, probably from last week's trip to the frozen river. You'll fix it tomorrow with gut thread. And that's the quiet truth of medieval survival. Gear wasn't disposable. It lived with you, grew with you, became an extension of your daily life. A cloak wasn't just something you wore, it was something you built around yourself like a second skin, full of hidden tricks and forgotten warmth. Something that reminded you, on the worst nights, that you had what you needed right on your back. So maybe the next time someone offers you a bug-out vest with 37 tactical compartments and a price tag that makes your eyes water, just nod politely. Then go home and stitch a secret pocket into your blanket. Because sometimes, the best survival tools don't beep, flash or break when they get wet. Sometimes, they just wrap around you and keep you warm. It's a quiet morning, unusually still, the kind that makes you feel like the world's holding its breath. Even the wind has taken a break. You sit near the fire, your hands cradling a mug of something warm, nettles steeped in boiled snow. Not exactly a latte, but it gets the job done. Your ribs ache when you breathe deep, and your right wrist is still sore from that fall last week when you slipped hauling wood. You don't talk about it, but the pain lingers. And that's the reality we're diving into tonight. What happens when things break? Inside you. Bones, skin, blood. No clinics. No ER. Just you. A few questionable tools and some absolutely medieval survival medicine. You shift your weight and glance toward the shelf above your sleeping area. That's where the tools are, if you can even call them that. A curved knife, blackened with age. A bowl made from a gourd, stained red from too many emergencies. A needle, bone-carved and threaded with horsehair. It's your surgical kit, and while you're no barber surgeon, you know enough to keep yourself in one piece. That sore wrist? You splintered it with hazel twigs wrapped in wool soaked in gluey tree sap. It's crude but functional. The swelling's gone down, the pain's localized, and you're confident it's not broken, just strained. If it were broken, You'd have had to set it yourself, which is a whole different nightmare. You've done it before, once, on your own foot. Took a flat stone and a leather strap and nearly passed out from the pain, but you walked again. Eventually. Here's your historical fact. Medieval bone setters, often women, midwives, or just local wise folk, developed surprisingly effective methods for dealing with breaks and dislocations. They used splints made from wood, leather and linen, soaked in egg whites or glue to harden around the limb. In many cases, their work rivaled or even surpassed what so-called professionals in cities could manage, because out in the countryside you didn't get a second opinion. You just got someone with experience and maybe a strong stomach. You've even dabbled in bloodletting, not because you believe in balancing humours, but because once, after an infection, you had no other choice. Your hand had swollen like a rotten apple, hot to the touch, and you knew something needed to come out. You heated your knife, said a few words to no one in particular, and opened a vein near your thumb. The blood spilled black and thick at first, and you almost fainted watching it. But the pressure eased. The next day, you could bend your fingers again. Maybe it was luck, maybe not. You glance at the dried herbs hanging from the rafters. Not just seasoning, medicine, yarrow for wounds, comfrey root for swelling, wild garlic for infections, St. John's wort when your mind gets dark and heavy. You've learned to recognise the signs of illness in your body the way others read a book. If your eyes feel dry and your breath smells sweet, you drink more. If your urine goes dark, you chew dandelion root. None of it is guaranteed, but it's better than waiting to die. Here's your fringe fact. There are recorded instances in medieval Europe of battlefield medics, yes, even back then, who used a kind of early antiseptic on wounds. They soaked moss in honey and wine, then packed it into cuts to prevent rot. Honey, being antimicrobial, actually works. Wine helped clean the area, and the moss acted like a sponge. It wasn't modern medicine, but in a time when most infections were death sentences, it saved lives. There's an open scholarly debate about how effective medieval medicine really was. Some claim it was mostly superstition and ritual, chicken bones and star charts. Others argue that folk practices, especially in rural areas, were deeply practical and based on centuries of observation. The truth is probably somewhere in between. You've tried both. You've smeared ash on cuts and muttered charms while setting a dislocated finger. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But when it's just you and the darkness, you'll try anything. You remember the time your neighbour's son took a tumble from the goat pen wall. Compound fracture. Bone poking clean through the skin. They came to you because they knew you had the strongest stomach in the village. You boiled your tools in ash water, poured what little honey you had over the wound and pushed the bone back in. It took 3 tries and more screaming than you'll ever forget. Then you bound the leg, packed it with moss and cobwebs. Yes, spider silk helps clotting, and prayed. He limped for months, but he lived. That's a win out here. You take a small piece of cloth and check the wound on your forearm, the one from that splintered fence rail. It's scabbing nicely, no swelling or streaks. You smeared it with a poultice of crushed garlic and animal fat 2 nights ago. Stinks like death, but it works. Your biggest concern now is keeping it dry. Infection is always lurking. You've seen what happens when someone doesn't notice the smell until it's too late. Blackened skin, fever dreams, and a burial pit no one wants to dig. And yet, somehow, you're still here. Part healer, part survivor, part science experiment. Your body's become a walking archive of trial and error. Scars that mark where you guessed wrong. Limps that remind you which side not to fall on. Every bruise, every healed break, a record of medieval medicine in action. You wrap your wrist again, tying the wool tight with your teeth. It'll hold. Maybe. If not, you'll figure it out tomorrow. Because the truth is, when you live like this, injury isn't an if, it's a when. And when it happens, you don't panic. You find the cleanest knife, the softest moss, the strongest thread, and you patch yourself back together like an old cloak. Modern preppers stock trauma kits with gauze, painkillers, tourniquets. That's smart. But if they ever run out, you'd like to see how they handle suturing a gash with horsehair in the glow of a dying fire. No antiseptic, no backup. Just grit, instinct, and the faint hope that your gut isn't lying to you. So yeah, it hurts. Everything hurts. But pain is part of the process now. You've stitched it. burned it, bled it, and somehow, despite all logic, you're still breathing. You're down to your last handful of dried beans, and the turnip in the corner has started to sprout a suspiciously long white tail. It's not quite panic yet, but it's definitely getting close. You've spent the winter burning through your hidden stores and chewing on memories, but the snow's beginning to melt in patches, revealing the first hints of green pushing up through the earth like stubborn little rebels. And that means it's time to forage. Time to go full green man mode. The half-forgotten medieval art of eating the wild world before it eats you. You grab your gathering satchel, a lopsided bag stitched from old cloak scraps and lined with birch bark to keep things dry, and head into the woods. Your boots sink into wet loam as you walk, the air thick with the smell of thawing rotten moss. The sun breaks through the trees in watery shafts, and for the first time in weeks it doesn't feel like the forest wants to kill you. Not immediately anyway. Foraging isn't a hobby here. It's a lifeline. You've memorised which trees bud first, which patches grow nettles, where the wild garlic curls out of the earth like green snakes. It's not just about knowing what's edible, it's about knowing what's medicinal, what's poison, and what will give you diarrhea so powerful it'll make you wish you hadn't survived winter at all. Here's your historical fact. During the medieval period, foraging was not only common but essential for peasants, monks, and even townsfolk. Wild greens like sorrel, nettle, chickweed, and dandelion made up a huge portion of the spring diet, especially during the hungry gap, that cursed stretch between the end of winter stores and the first real summer harvest. Foraging was the difference between starvation and just barely scraping by. You crouch near a patch of nettles, their jagged leaves shimmering with dew. Most people avoid them because of the sting, tiny hairs filled with formic acid, but you know better. A quick slap to bruise the leaf, a long boil, and they're packed with iron, vitamin C, and whatever else your starving body is begging for. You fill your satchel carefully, moving slow to avoid a wristful of regret. Further down the trail you spot the telltale white flowers of wild garlic, growing in clusters like tiny lanterns. The smell hits you before the sight. Sharp, pungent, mouth-watering. You pick a handful and shove them into the bag, already thinking about the soup you'll make, or maybe just chew on them raw. Either way, it's better than bark. Here's your quirky fringe fact. Some medieval communities believe that wild plants, especially those that grew on graves or near ancient stones, carried spiritual power. Healing if harvested properly, curses if taken carelessly. That's why foragers sometimes whispered to the earth, left behind bits of bread or salt or gathered only at dawn. It wasn't superstition so much as survival insurance. You've done it yourself. Can't hurt, right? You pass by a patch of mushrooms and stop. Not all mushrooms are death, but enough are that it's like playing botanical roulette. These ones are small, yellowish, with a fishy smell. You leave them alone. Your gut says no, and you've learned to trust your gut, especially since you don't have a medieval stomach pump on hand. There's a debate among historians and botanists about how much wild food was actually consumed in day-to-day peasant life. Some argue it was supplemental, gathered in spring and autumn but never the main meal. Others say foraging played a major role in the diet for large parts of the year, especially in poorer regions or during frequent famines. Considering your current menu, you're going with the latter. You find a cluster of violets blooming against the base of an old oak and grin, edible, mildly sweet, and good for lifting the mood, or so the elders say. You pluck a few and pop one in your mouth. It tastes like green water and a memories. Not much substance, but a welcome change from stale bread and dried roots. On your way back, you pass a spot where you buried a salted rabbit 2 months ago, packed in a wooden box with dry moss and snow. You dig it out, sniff carefully, and find it's still good. Barely. You wrap it in leaves and toss it in the satchel with your greens. Dinner's going to be weird, but it'll be warm, and that's what counts. Back at the hut, you lay everything out on a flat stone. Nettles, garlic, violets, one semi-thawed rabbit. You toss it all into your iron pot with some melted snow and leftover bean water. The smell as it simmers is almost enough to make you cry. Real food. Fresh, living food. After months of chewing on freeze-dried despair and leather scraps, it's a feast. Here's the part that most modern preppers miss. Survival isn't just about calories. It's about micronutrients, vitamins, the little things your body needs to not just exist but actually keep functioning. Scurvy doesn't care how many tins of beans you stockpiled, but nettles do. Sorrel does. Dandelion root laughs at your pantry and says, "I'll see you in spring." You eat slowly, dipping rough bread into the green steaming broth. The rabbit's stringy but rich. The greens are bitter but bright. It tastes like dirt and iron and survival. It tastes like being alive. Afterward, you scrape the pot clean, hang your satchel to dry, and jot down a quick mark on the beam above your bed. A simple symbol that means garlic blooms today. You've been tracking plant cycles for years now, watching the forest shift, taking notes and symbols you invented. It's your almanac, your only calendar, and it tells you the world is waking up. So maybe you're not living off MREs or vitamin tablets, but you're thriving in your own weird way, chewing your way through the wilderness like a barefoot nutritionist. And while most people wouldn't dare eat something they found growing next to a goat skull in a ditch, you know better. Because in the medieval world, food wasn't on a shelf. It was in the ground, in the trees, growing wild behind the barn where no one bothered to look. And out here, that's exactly where you're looking. The fire's gone out again. Not all the way, just enough to let the chill creep back into your bones like a slow leak in a sinking boat. You curse softly under your breath, roll over, and start the morning ritual, blowing softly on a handful of stubborn coals, feeding them dry moss, and praying they don't punish you with smoke in the face. It's tedious, it's essential, but as the flames finally spark back to life, you're already thinking ahead, beyond heat, beyond cooking. Tonight, you're going to talk about one of the strangest survival superfoods the medieval world had to offer. Not berries, not herbs, but animal fat. Yes, tonight we're getting greasy. Out here, a single pig could light your winter. Not metaphorically, literally. Because once the meat is gone and the bones have been boiled for broth, and the scraps fed to the chickens or thrown to the dogs, there's still the fat. White, waxy, slippery stuff scraped from ribs, bellies, and joints. You render it down into tallow or lard, depending on what animal gave it to you, and then you get creative. Cooking, sure, but also light, soap, protection, and even medicine. It's the medieval multi-tool nobody wants to admit they need. You step outside into the pale morning light, the cold biting at your cheeks. A bucket sits half full with solidified lard, left over from the last butchering in early winter. You bring it inside and chip off a chunk. Just holding it makes your hands feel warmer. It's dense, stable, and doesn't go rancid for months if kept cool and covered. You drop a hunk into your pot for today's stew, and the rest, well, that's where things get interesting. Here's your historical fact. In medieval households, especially rural ones, animal fat was a core resource. Lard from pigs and tallow from cows or sheep were used not just for cooking, but for making rushlights, primitive candles made by dipping dried plant stalks in hot fat. They were smoky, they stank, and they burned fast. But when you don't have beeswax or oil, that little flame means everything. You dip a twisted cord of dried nettle stalk into a tin cup of hot lard, wait for it to soak, then light it with an ember from the fire. The flame flickers, yellow and low, but it casts enough light to see your hands, and that's enough. You set it in a clay holder on the table and feel the hut slowly warm, not from the fire, but from the illusion of a light. When you're living on the edge of survival, even a faint glow can feel like a victory. But fat wasn't just for light or flavour. You've used it to waterproof your boots, rubbed into the seams and along the soles. You've used it to polish tools, grease hinges, and soften stiff leather. On your worst days, you even used it on your skin. A smear of lard over cracked knuckles can mean the difference between working fingers and frostbitten stumps. Now for your quirky fringe fact, some medieval texts reference the use of fat, particularly human fat, in magical or medicinal recipes. Not all scholars agree, but there are whispers of thieves' salve, a mythic mixture said to protect grave robbers from plague, made from animal fat, herbs, and other less pleasant ingredients. You don't have any use for that sort of thing, but it does make you look twice at old jars in forgotten corners. Back in the here and now, you're preparing your fire for another use of fat, soap. It's a rare treat when you have enough to spare, but a basic soap can be made from wood ash, which you've got plenty of, and rendered fat. Mix them together, carefully, and you get lye soap. Harsh, sure, but it'll clean your hands, your clothes, and even help treat wounds. Not bad for something scraped off a pig's back and filtered through a dead tree. There's an ongoing debate about how widespread soap actually was among peasants. Some historians argue that it was mostly for the wealthy, given the labour and ingredients involved. Others point to regional recipes and household records suggesting that even the poor knew how to make a rough version, especially in colder climates where filth meant frostbite. You're in the latter camp. After all, you've made it with nothing more than a cracked pot and enough firewood to keep the mixture boiling for a few hours. The batch you're working on today is tiny, just enough to clean your clothes and maybe bathe once, if you get ambitious. It stinks like old bacon and burnt bark. But when it hardens in a few days, you'll have a chunk of soft, greasy, faintly caustic soap. A treasure, really. While the pot simmers, you take what's left of the tallow and pack it into a clay bowl. You press in some pine resin and crushed nettle leaves, your version of medicinal balm. It's not pretty, but it draws out splinters, soothes burns, and keeps cuts from drying into cracked scabs. Better than nothing. Much better, actually. And now, the stew. You stir the pot where yesterday's foraged greens are bubbling with beans and a tiny piece of rabbit. The fat floating on top glistens in the firelight. That sheen, that's life. Every mouthful warms you from the inside. It sticks to your ribs, fuels your muscles, and lingers in your belly like a good memory. Carbs are fine, but fat is energy. Real energy. The kind you need to split wood, haul water, outrun wolves, or survive the night when it dips below freezing again. You ladle out a bowl and sip. It's rich, oily, a little gritty from the ash you didn't strain well enough, but nourishing. You scrape every bit of fat from the rim and lick your fingers, nothing wasted, ever. You clean the pot with a scrap of straw and some leftover ash soap, rinse it with snowmelt and set it near the fire to dry. Then you stretch your arms and feel the warmth lingering in your muscles, not from the fire, from the food, from the fat. So while some preppers stock up on protein powders and powdered eggs, you're over here singing hymns to the humble pig. You don't just store calories, you transform them into light, into warmth, into soap and balm and healing. You make survival out of scraps and luxury out of lard. It's not glamorous, it's not clean, but it works. And in the end, a single animal, if you know how to use every part, can get you through the longest, darkest winter of your life. Just don't forget to render the fat. It may be the greasiest thing you do, but it might also be the smartest. The fire is low again, crackling quietly as a thin curl of smoke winds up toward the thatch. It's well past midnight, but you're not sleeping. Not yet. There's something in the woods tonight. You can feel it, like pressure behind your eyes, like the air is listening. You ease your back off the hut wall, ears tuned to every creak of the trees and snap of frozen underbrush. This is when the danger comes, not just from hunger or cold, but from what moves through the dark. And if you're smart, you'll remember what the old folk taught. How to fight off wolves with a fireball, or something close enough to make them run. You shuffle to the door, pull it open just wide enough to see. Outside, frost glitters on everything, moonlight painting the trees in silver and shadows. That sound again, low, too heavy to be wind. You don't see them yet, but you know they're there. Maybe wolves, maybe worse. In the medieval wilds, plenty of things stalked the night. Wolves, yes, but also desperate men, thieves, outlaws, the kinds of predators that don't flinch at a prayer or a locked door. But here's the trick. You don't need a sword. You don't need armour. What you need is fire. Here's your historical fact. Medieval villagers understood that fire wasn't just for warmth, it was defence. During harsh winters and siege seasons, people used fire not only as light, but as a literal weapon. Torches, burning pitch, and even bundles of dried reeds soaked in animal fat were hurled into the night to scare off wolves and bandits alike. It was chaotic. It was primal. It was effective. You move fast now, collecting your supplies from near the hearth. A bundle of dried rushes, a clay pot with old tallow, a cloth soaked in animal fat wrapped tightly around a stick. You dip the cloth into the pot, let it saturate, then pull it out and wrap it tighter, binding it with a strip of rawhide. The smell is awful, greasy, acrid, but that's exactly what you want. You strike a spark into the bundle and watch it ignite with a wet whoosh of flame. The torch flares to life, sputtering and hissing as the fat cooks off. You open the door fully now, stepping outside into the chill, holding the fire high. The smoke chokes your nose, but your eyes are clear, wide, alert. And then you see them, just beyond the edge of the trees, eyes, low to the ground, watching. 4, maybe 5 pairs. Wolves. Hungry. Bold. You don't panic. You raise the torch and shout. Not words, just noise. Deep and loud. Something to stir the air and ripple the trees. The wolves don't run. Not yet. They shift, stepping forward, testing your confidence. You step forward too, slow and steady, waving the torch in wide arcs. Then, with one practiced motion, you hurl it into the brush between you and them. The burst of light and crackle of dry branches is enough. The wolves scatter, silent as ghosts, vanishing into the forest without a sound. You don't follow, you just stand there, breathing hard, the wind stealing warmth from your skin as fast as the fire gave it. But you're still here. That's what matters. Here's your fringe fact. In some medieval regions, villagers created what they called fire wheels, or rolling fire barrels, makeshift weapons crafted from barrels filled with pitch and hay, lit and rolled downhill toward enemies or predators. It sounds theatrical, but there are real records of this happening during raids and sieges. Fire wasn't just defense, it was a psychological weapon. There's a debate among historians about whether these techniques were common or reserved for the most desperate circumstances. Some argue that rural communities rarely had the resources for such elaborate tactics. Others point out that creativity often trumps scarcity, and that desperation breeds some of the best inventions. Considering you just scared off a pack of wolves with a torch and some bacon grease, you're leaning toward the latter. You stamp out what's left of the burning bundle, burying the embers with dirt and snow. The night seems quieter now. Still dangerous, sure, but you've reminded the woods who's in charge, or at least who's crazy enough to light a fire and throw it. Back inside, you rub the smoke from your face and toss your cloak back over your shoulders. The rush of adrenaline is fading, replaced by a kind of hollow exhaustion. But that's part of the deal. Medieval survival isn't about comfort. It's about readiness. You don't go to bed thinking the world will leave you alone. You go to bed with one eye open, one ear tuned, and your fire tools always within reach. You sit by the hearth and check your stash. More rushes, a lump of resin. Enough tallow to make 2 more torches if you're careful. You'll need to collect more fat soon, or barter for it. If the snow keeps melting, maybe you can set some traps, or find something freshly dead that didn't freeze fast enough to rot. It's not a fun thought, but fat is fuel, fuel is fire, and fire is life. So while modern survivalists prep with firearms and motion detectors, you're over here perfecting the art of medieval pyromania. Because when the wolves come calling, and they will, it won't be your ammo count that saves you. It'll be your willingness to throw flaming garbage into the woods and scream like a lunatic. And if that's not survival, what is? Morning breaks through the thatch in streaks of gold and dust. You're still half asleep, head nestled in the crook of your arm, dreaming of a world with soft beds and warm bread. Then you hear it, the dull clang of metal on metal, distant but rising, a rhythm too quick to be the blacksmith's forge. You sit bolt upright. That's not hammering, that's the bell, not the church bell, the village bell. And it only rings for 3 things: fire, raiders, or plague. You scramble up and throw on your cloak, heart already hammering. Out here, isolation is your survival plan. But sometimes the trouble comes anyway. And when it does, you'd better be ready. Because tonight, we're talking about the medieval emergency alert system, the village bell code. You step outside, ears straining. 3 rings, then a pause, then 3 more. Fire. It's always fire this time of year. Too many careless hands, too many dry barns. You tighten your boots and head toward the signal tower, a crude wooden frame built on a hill just high enough to overlook the tree line. The bell hangs from a splintered beam, nothing more than a cast iron pot repurposed for noise, but it does the job. When that thing rings, every soul within earshot stops what they're doing. Here's your historical fact. In medieval Europe, especially in rural communities, bells were central to daily life. Church bells marked the hours, sure, but village bells, separate. often mounted on poles or in towers, were used to signal emergencies. Each event had its own rhythm. Fire was 3 rings in quick succession. Raids were slow, heavy tolls, one after another. And plague? Plague was a steady, sorrowful chime, rung low and long to mark death walking in daylight. You reach the clearing by the tower and find a cluster of villagers already gathered, breath steaming, eyes wide with dread. Smoke curls in the distance. Someone's barn, maybe. A spark from the hearth, a toppled torch. It doesn't take much. In a village built mostly from straw, wood and daub, fire spreads like gossip in a crowded tavern. Someone grabs a bucket, another hauls a leather sack of water from the well. There's no fire brigade, no emergency line to call. It's all hands, or no hands. And if the fire reaches the thatched roofs, it's over. Here's your fringe fact. Some medieval towns required every household to keep a certain number of buckets and tools on hand, not just for their own safety, but for the community's. You didn't wait for permission to act. If the bell rang, you ran, carrying water, blankets, shovels, or even manure. Yes, manure. Wet dung was used to smother flames, especially when water ran short. It stank, but it worked. There's still debate among historians about whether all villages had standardized bell codes. Some argue that each region had its own rhythms, learned by memory, not by design. Others suggest that codes were passed down and taught like lullabies. 3 for fire, 5 for raid, slow tolls for death. Either way, once you heard it, you knew what to do. Today, you run with the others toward the smoke, the icy ground slick beneath your boots. The barn's already half consumed, flames curling through the roof like eager fingers. A few animals are still inside, bleating in panic. You don't stop to think. You drop your bucket, yank open the latch, and shout into the smoke. A goat bolts past you, singed but alive. A second one follows, eyes rolling in terror. You catch a third by the collar and drag it out as embers rain down like sparks from a blacksmith's anvil. The others are working fast, forming a bucket line from the well, tossing water on the fire with desperate rhythm. It won't save the barn, not entirely, but it might keep the flames from jumping to the neighbouring homes. After what feels like hours, the blaze is finally smothered, the last beams collapsing in a hiss of steam and soot. You're covered in ash, fingers numb from cold and water, throat raw from smoke, but you're standing, and so is the village. That's what counts. You gather with the others around the remains, coughing and cursing and thanking saints. The bell hangs silent now, its job done for the day. You look at it differently now, not just as a signal, but as a voice, the voice of the village, of survival. And here's something else the modern world forgets. In a society without phones, texts, or alerts, bells were your only warning, your lifeline. They called you to prayer, yes, but they also called you to battle, to mourning, to help your neighbour save their animals from a burning stable. The bell wasn't just a noise, it was command and communion all at once. You trudge back home as the sun creeps higher, dragging with you the stink of smoke and adrenaline. Your cloak is scorched at the hem, your boots are wet through, but your house is still standing, and that's worth more than any warm bed or soft bread you could have been dreaming of. Back at your hut, you strip off the wet layers, hang them by the fire and wrap yourself in a wool blanket. The goats are safe, the barn is gone, the bell is quiet. But you know it'll ring again. It always does. Fire, raiders, plague. Sometimes all 3. So while modern preppers rely on radio alerts and emergency apps, you've got a bell, a hunk of iron that hangs from a beam and tells you when to run, when to fight, when to say goodbye. And you listen. Because out here, ignorance isn't just dangerous, it's fatal. You close your eyes for a moment, still tasting smoke in the back of your throat, and you wonder how many other villagers are out there, listening to their own bells, saving their own goats, cursing their own bad luck. Probably more than you think, because survival doesn't always look like bug-out bags and bunkers. Sometimes it sounds like 3 quick clangs on a cold morning, and the thud of your boots as you run toward the fire, not away from it. The barn's gone, and with it, a decent portion of the village's winter hay. But somehow, you and the others manage to save the goats, Keep the fire from jumping the road and even scavenge a few unburnt timbers. Not a total loss. But now comes the harder part. Not fighting the fire, but surviving after it. The usual comforts are dwindling fast. Your pantry's picked over, your turnips have grown legs and ideas, and you're about to revisit one of the least appetising yet strangely effective medieval survival techniques known to humankind. Burying bread and drying rats. You sit at your table with a lump of what used to be rye bread. It's grey, hard as a brick. You knock it against the table, and it sounds like a warning. This loaf was baked late last autumn, overcooked on purpose, then buried in a clay jar beneath your sleeping mat sealed in ashen wax. You dig it up when times are desperate, which is now. The first step is to soften it. You soak it in a pot of hot water and broth until the edges begin to crumble like old parchment. Then you mash it with a pestle, mix in whatever wild greens or dried roots you've got left, and pray it tastes like something other than regret. It doesn't, but it fills your stomach. That's all you need it to do. Here's your historical fact. Medieval Europeans developed techniques for extending the shelf life of bread by baking loaves until they were completely dry, then storing them in underground pits or clay jars. This wasn't bread as we think of it. It was more like a preserved ration, reconstituted in stews or broths during lean seasons. Especially during the hungry gap, buried bread was the difference between holding on and wasting away. You chew slowly, trying not to chip a tooth, and chase it with warm water infused with the last of your dried fennel. It's bitter, but it settles your stomach. You remember your grandmother teaching you how to make this kind of bread. Flour, salt, water, and barely any yeast. Double baked, first in a hot oven, then again at a lower temperature until every drop of moisture was gone. If it crumbles, it'll rot, she said. If it cracks your teeth, you're doing it right. And then there are the rats. You tried traps. Some worked, others just left you with chewed bait and stolen hopes. But a week ago you caught 3 in one night. Big ones too. Clean kills thanks to the old spring-snap snare you rigged from a broken spoon and some cordage. You didn't celebrate, you got to work. Skinning a rat is quick, less hair to deal with than a rabbit, but more judgment. Their little black eyes always make you hesitate, but you don't have that luxury anymore. You clean them, gut them, soak the meat in a brine of ash water and garlic, and hang the strips above the fire to dry. The fat's minimal, but the protein, still valuable. Here's your fringe fact. In parts of medieval Europe, rat meat wasn't just survival food. It was sometimes bartered or included in famine-time diets, especially during sieges or plagues when livestock was scarce. It wasn't spoken of kindly, but it wasn't taboo either. Desperation has a way of reclassifying what counts as meat. You pull down a strip of rat jerky from the line and nibble it thoughtfully. It's smoky, salty, chewy. Not pleasant, not revolting. You've eaten worse. It's amazing how after weeks of hunger, your taste buds recalibrate. Now, anything with even a whisper of protein tastes like luxury. There's an open debate among food historians about how common rat consumption truly was. Some argue it was more folklore than fact, exaggerated by chroniclers trying to emphasise the horrors of famine. Others point to recipes, journals and letters that mentioned it openly, especially in war-torn regions. You don't need a debate, you just need calories. The trick is not just in catching or cooking them, it's in making the meat last. You've learned to dry it slowly, over smoky coals, not flames. You wrap the jerky in cloth soaked in vinegar, then store it in a sealed pot lined with pine needles. It's not preservation as we know it today, but it's enough to keep the rot away. Most of the time. And speaking of preservation, you've got one last. Trick up your soot-stained sleeve. Burial in snow. Out back, behind your hut, you've dug a small pit, lined with stones, packed with snow and covered in branches. It's your freezer. Right now, it holds 2 dried loaves, a bundle of rat jerky, a hunk of salted rabbit fat, and your last jar of gooseberry mash. Not a feast, but enough for a few more days. You know that when the weather shifts, that snow pit becomes useless. That's when buried bread and jerky really earn their keep. No rot, no spoilage, just dry, stable, and tough enough to outlast whatever this week tries to throw at you. Back inside, you stir the pot. Today's meal is soaked bread, boiled with wild greens, rat jerky, and a single sliver of lard. It looks like something scraped off a medieval boot, It smells like campfire and onions, and it's the best thing you've eaten all week. You ladle out a bowl, eat slowly, savouring each oily, chewy, slightly gamey bite. You don't think about what it is, you think about what it means, another day survived. Because this awful, brilliant, resourceful mess is what modern preppers rarely consider. They want shelf-stable food, vacuum-sealed and freeze-dried. You've got buried bricks of bread and rodent meat slow-dried above a dung-fueled fire. It's not pretty, it's not marketable, but it works, and when you scrape your bowl clean, hang the pot to dry, and settle in beside the fire, your belly feels full, not stuffed, not satisfied, but full enough to get through the night. So while others plan for the end of the world with gourmet survival kits and tactical gear, you're living it one crunchy loaf and dried rat strip at a time. No shame, no waste, just survival. It's strange what starts to feel normal after a while, how the taste of ash in your food becomes just flavour, how the sting of cold in your joints becomes background noise. But tonight, as you step outside, you're reminded of the strangest survival technique in your arsenal. Not something you grow or cook or even build. No, this one's more atmospheric. You reach down, scoop up a handful of dung, and smear it along the seams of your cloak. Yeah, tonight we're talking about camouflage with cow dung, or pig dung, horse dung, goat, whatever you've got really. Because sometimes survival means disappearing, and in the medieval world when you couldn't fight and couldn't run, the smartest thing to do was vanish into the landscape. Not metaphorically, physically, odour and all. It started with the livestock, of course. Back when raids were common and bandits roamed like wolves, peasants learned to hide. Not just their food and their tools, but themselves. And if you were out in the open, if you got caught out in the woods when the wrong kind of traveller passed through, you did what the deer did, you crouched low, went still, and let the forest eat you, blending into the world with whatever nature offered, even if it was steaming and foul-smelling. You move through the edge of the woods now, low and quiet, cloak pulled tight and patched with dried mud and manure. From a distance, you don't look like a person. You look like a boulder, or a bush. Maybe a clump of something unpleasant. That's the point. No movement, no glint of metal, just a lump of the land smelling exactly like it. You squat behind a tangle of brambles listening. A bird takes off overhead, startled by something larger. You wait. No footsteps, no voices, just the wind. Here's your historical fact. During times of conflict, raids, civil wars, or peasant revolts, people often camouflaged themselves using local materials. Mud, soot, moss, and yes, manure. Forest ambushes and escape tactics were built on invisibility. Cloaks were intentionally dirtied. Faces were smeared with ash. Some even packed earth into their mouths to dull the glint of teeth. When you're prey, sparkle is a liability. You move again, ducking under a fallen tree, careful not to disturb the brush. The dung crust crackles slightly as it flexes, but it holds. You've used this technique before, when tax collectors came through with suspicious eyes, when strangers passed through asking too many questions, when wild dogs sniffed around the meat pit. It's not about looking good. It's about not being seen at all. Here's your fringe fact. In some medieval tales and local folk practices, camouflaging with excrement wasn't just for stealth. It was seen as protective. Some believed that predators and spirits wouldn't touch the unclean, that the stink made you invisible to more than just eyes. It was disgusting, sure, but in a world of superstition and survival, you never really knew what worked because of science, and what worked because the forest decided to spare you that day. There's still a debate among anthropologists about how widespread these dung-based stealth tactics really were. Some claim they were extreme last-ditch methods, used only in desperation. Others point to recurring references in folk stories, oral traditions, and even military accounts, suggesting that yes, people absolutely smeared themselves with whatever was handy, if it meant slipping past a patrol or avoiding a sword in the ribs. You keep low, weaving through the underbrush, heart pounding with every step, even though there's no real threat in sight now. Just a precautionary patrol, your version of medieval paranoia. You circle back toward your hut the long way, avoiding the road, even though it would be faster. Roads are for the confident, trails are for the desperate. Back at the edge of your garden, you pause to rub another layer of filth into your boots. They blend in better that way. You've even dabbed some around the rim of your hood, masking your scent. Dogs hate it. That's the goal. If the bandits ever come through with hunting animals, you want them to sniff and keep walking. The sun's dipping low, the sky a muddy smear of orange and grey. You scrape off the largest chunks with a stick and hang the cloak just inside the door to dry. It'll flake overnight, but the smell will linger. You've gotten used to it. You almost don't smell it anymore, though when a friend stops by, they wince and offer you a sprig of pine out of politeness. Inside, you check the fire, toss in a handful of bark and settle in with your back to the wall. Your hands are stained, your boots caked, your face streaked with something that definitely isn't charcoal. And yet, if someone came hunting through the woods tonight, they'd pass right by. They'd smell farmyard, not food, filth, not fear, and they'd keep walking. That's the brilliance of it. You don't just hide from sight, you hide from instinct. The smell of manure sends a clear message. Nothing valuable here. Just animals. Just muck. Nothing worth stealing. Definitely nothing worth stabbing. Modern preppers talk a lot about concealment. Ghillie suits, thermal blankets, blackout curtains. You've got a bucket of pig dung, a brush made from straw, and an unshakable sense of pride. Because the truth is, no one wants to search through something that stinks. So while they're out there building panic rooms with motion sensors, you're here perfecting the ancient art of becoming invisible by being absolutely disgusting. It's not glamorous. But then again, neither is being caught. And as you drift off to sleep with the scent of survival still clinging to your skin, you know this. When the danger comes next time, you won't need to run. You'll already be gone. You dream of water, clear, sweet, flowing over smooth stones under a sun that actually warms instead of mocks. You wake up choking on dust, tongue like leather, lips split. It's been 2 days since you last found enough snow to melt, and your stores are dangerously low. The river's still iced over, the rain is weeks away, and you've already scraped every barrel and cistern for the last drop. Time to get creative. Time to remember what the old ones used to whisper when things got dry and desperate. Look where no one else looks. Time to gather water from the grave. That's not just a poetic turn of phrase. In the medieval world, water wasn't always found in bubbling springs or convenient wells. Sometimes it came from places you'd rather not be near. Crypts, buried hollows, forgotten cellars. Places where condensation, snowmelt, or groundwater pooled. If you knew where to dig and weren't too scared to do it. You pull on your cloak and boots, grab your spade and head out past the garden and the tree line toward the old chapel ruins. It's half swallowed by the earth now, the roof long gone, the stones cracked and overgrown. But beneath it, there's a crypt, or what's left of one. You remember the first time you heard about it? Whispers from a one-eyed cooper who claimed he'd once pulled buckets of holy water from under a chapel floor during the worst drought of his life. You didn't believe him then. You do now. Here's your historical fact. In many medieval churches and monasteries, crypts and underground spaces unintentionally became water reservoirs. The thick stone walls trapped cold, condensation formed, and during rainy seasons, water seeped in and pooled. It wasn't always clean, it was often stagnant and foul-smelling. But when the choice was that or dying of thirst, people chose the crypt. You reach the edge of the sunken chapel and lower yourself carefully into the collapsed floor. A few steps remain of the stairway that once led below, now half buried under dirt and bone-dry moss. You dig carefully, scraping away at the frozen earth until the spade hits something soft and wet. Mud. That's a good sign. You dig deeper, cupping the dark soil in your hands and pressing it into your cloth bag. You'll squeeze it out back home, but it's not enough. You need more. You remember another place. Further out, near the old Gallows Hill. There was a well there once, now long disused. People stopped drinking from it generations ago, convinced it was cursed. You don't care. You're not in a position to be choosy. On the way, you pass patches of moss and lichen clinging to stone. That's another trick. You press a wool cloth against the moss, soak it, then wring it out into a jar. A few spoonfuls at a time. It takes hours to fill even half a cup, but it's something. Here's your quirky fringe fact. Some medieval peasants believed that dew collected before sunrise, gathered from grass, leaves and even gravestones, had healing properties and was cleaner than rain. In truth, It was just another desperate way to harvest water. Old women would drag sheets across damp fields, then wring them out over pots. A whole morning's work might yield one decent sip. You reach the well near the gallows and lower a stone tied to a rope. You hear the splash after a few seconds. It's shallow, but there's water. The wood around the well is rotted and black with mould. The stone's loose. You brace yourself, tie the rope to your waist, and lower yourself down slowly. You're not proud, you're not brave, you're thirsty. At the bottom, the water is dark and smells like iron, but you can see your reflection. That's good. If you can see light, you can see hope. You dip your gourd and fill it slowly, careful not to stir up too much silt. You climb back up, palms slipping on wet stone, and collapse at the edge, panting. You smell like moss and mould and wet rope, but your hands are full. There's debate among modern historians about how medieval people actually treated and stored water. Some claim they drank from rivers and ponds without a second thought, their guts hardened by years of exposure. Others argue they were far more cautious, boiling and filtering where possible, especially in cities where contamination ran rampant. Out here, you don't boil unless you have to. Wood is too precious. But you filter everything, through cloth, charcoal, or the old gravel and sand trick that tastes like chewing on a road but usually doesn't kill you. Back home, you strain the water through your best linen scrap, then boil just enough to make a weak broth. You ration it. A few sips every hour. You save the moss water for washing your face and hands. Every drop is accounted for. Later, as the sun begins to dip, you set up your dew trap, a stretched cloth between 4 sticks, angled to collect condensation overnight. It's slow, inefficient, but it works. You've even buried clay pots with wide mouths at the base of certain trees hoping to catch runoff. When the rain doesn't come, you learn to mimic it. And here's something else you don't tell people. You once drank from a grave, not just near one, from one. Last summer during a heat wave, the spring dried up and you were days from collapse. You found a fresh burial, just a peasant woman, no family, and noticed a trickle of water collecting in the depression. You dug carefully, lined a hole with clay and cloth, let the water seep in slow, drank it, lived. Didn't sleep well for a week, but you lived. That's the truth of medieval survival. You don't get to be picky, you don't ask questions, you don't say no to a drink just because it came from under someone's ribcage. You close your eyes, say a prayer, and swallow. So while modern preppers stock bottled water and purification tablets, you're over here gathering dew from grave moss, digging into church cellars, and filtering puddles through your socks. You've turned desperation into ritual, and every time the cup reaches your lips you remember. The human body can go weeks without food, but only days without water. You drink, you live, you repeat. You're planting in the early morning light, fingers deep in cold, damp soil, your breath fogging in front of your face like smoke from a tired fire. The ground's still waking up after the long freeze, but you can feel the pulse of it. Slow, stubborn, ready. It's planting season. And you're not just putting food in the ground, you're putting weapons there too. Because this garden, it doesn't just feed you, it defends you. Welcome to the forgotten, weirdly brilliant world of poisonous gardens and survival botany with an edge. You reach into a burlap sack and pull out a handful of seeds, some for turnips, some for garlic, and 1 or 2 that could kill a grown man in the right tea. You don't mix them. You keep them in different cloth bundles marked with knots and smells. Some go into the vegetable patch, others get planted along the perimeter of your hut. You're not growing food with those, you're growing deterrents. Medieval security systems, root-based revenge, floral booby traps. Here's your historical fact. Poison gardens were very real in the Middle Ages. Monasteries, manor houses, and even village healers kept dedicated plots for dangerous herbs, deadly nightshade, wolfsbane, hemlock, foxglove. Not for casual use, but as medicine, defence, and in some cases subtle warfare. Knowledge of these plants was passed down quietly, often from mother to daughter, or between apothecaries who understood that the line between medicine and murder was thin and walked daily. You plant monkshood in a shaded corner, away from the food beds. It's beautiful. Deep purple, almost royal, but you treat it like fire. Gloves on, no touching the roots. Every part of it's poisonous. In small doses it numbs. In larger ones it stops hearts. You've never used it on anyone, but you keep it, just in case. Along the path to your door, you've planted stinging nettles. Not because they're useful, they are, but because they hurt. Anyone trying to sneak up at night won't appreciate the rash they'll get from brushing past those in the dark. It's not lethal, but it's loud. People curse when they hit nettles, and curses wake you up. You've also strung lines of garlic and rue across the windows. That's partly tradition, partly belief. Garlic's always been seen as a protector, against illness, against evil, even against certain insects. The rue is for luck, or to offend someone's nose so badly they lose the will to rob you. Either way, you're not taking it down. Here's your fringe fact. In some parts of medieval Europe, women accused of witchcraft were actually just extremely good at growing dangerous gardens. Their knowledge of poisons and potions terrified people, especially because they understood dosage, timing, and intent. Many of these women were also the community's midwives and herbalists, respected in the shadows, feared in the open. You pull a small sprig of henbane from the ground. It grew wild near the woods and you've transplanted it carefully. It smells awful, and even the rabbits leave it alone. In low doses it dulls pain. In high doses it sends people on visions they might never return from. You dry it high in the rafters, where no one will accidentally brew it into tea. Because that's the danger too. Everything useful can become deadly if you forget what it is. There's still an ongoing scholarly debate about how much the average medieval peasant understood plant toxicity. Some argue they knew very little, that only trained monks and physicians grasped the real chemistry of herbs. Others point to the survival of so many folk remedies, oral traditions and cautious practices that suggest deep, if undocumented, understanding. You're proof of the latter. You learned from people who never wrote a word, but who could keep a man alive through a fever, or stop a warband's leader with a cup of something too sweet to be safe. You remember the story your grandfather told, about the time raiders came through a neighbouring village. The men were too few to fight, the walls too weak to defend. But the women offered them drinks, sweetened with berries, laced with foxglove. The raiders never made it to the next town. No one ever spoke of it directly. But everyone remembered that spring's unusually quiet aftermath. You're not hoping to poison anyone, but you are prepared. The world doesn't give out medals for surviving. It just gives you another day to keep your blood inside your body. So you plant carefully and intentionally, healing herbs in one patch, toxins in another, and a few that blur the line in between. Back inside, you inventory your drying racks, valerian root, skullcap, horehound. You've labelled them with bits of twine and smell markers. Strong herbs wrapped around the bundle so you don't mix them up in the dark. One mix cures a headache, another might make you sleep forever. You take no chances. And here's the thing, none of this is new. While modern preppers store antibiotics and iodine tablets, you're using what the forest offers, and what your ancestors quietly taught in whispers and calloused hands. You don't have a medicine cabinet, you have a garden with moods. You boil a pot of nettle and sage tea, strong, earthy, medicinal, and sip slowly. It tastes like the bottom of a field, but it warms your chest and clears your sinuses. Outside, the wind rustles through the henbane and monkshood, like a warning, like a ward. Your garden doesn't look pretty, it looks like it bites, and that's exactly the point, because when someone stumbles too close to your hut, sees the black stalks and purple bells, smells the sharpness of rue and crushed garlic, they might think twice. Is this a healer's home? A hedge witch's hut? Or just a poor soul with very unpleasant taste in plants? You don't care what they think, you just care that they leave. So while the world dreams of electric fences and motion detectors, you're here planting paranoia into the soil, mixing beauty with threat, and drinking your bitter tea like it's the sweetest thing you've ever tasted. Because survival, sometimes it grows best where nothing else wants to. The first real spring rain hits just after midnight. Soft at first, then steady, then wild. You hear it coming like a slow march through the trees, the leaves dancing awake, the roof dripping in rhythms that make you forget how long winter's been squatting over your life. You sit up, blink into the darkness, and smile. Rain. Real, life-bringing, drinkable rain. And you know what that means. Time to catch it. Every drop. Because tonight's not about barrels or buckets. It's about ancient low-tech hydration hacks. Medieval rain catchers and dew traps. the kind modern preppers dismiss in favour of fancy gear they'll forget how to use when the power goes out. You kick off your blanket, throw on your cloak, and push open the door. The smell hits you first. Rich, green, earthy. Rain on dirt, rain on wood, rain on your face. You stick your tongue out like a child and laugh. Not much falls straight into your mouth, but it's enough to remind you what clean water actually tastes like. Then you get to work. You drag out your water traps, flat cloth stretched across wooden frames, arranged to funnel droplets into narrow channels carved into hollowed-out logs. Simple, effective, and older than memory. The cloths are waxed on one side, tied with gut thread to keep their shape and angle just right. You set out 4, then check the stone cistern you patched together last autumn, from scavenged slabs and mortar made of ash and clay. It's already catching runoff from the slope behind your hut. The trickle is constant. Your grin gets wider. Here's your historical fact. Medieval households, especially in regions with unpredictable rainfall, used a variety of techniques to harvest rain. Thatched roofs channeled water into wooden gutters, which then poured into cisterns or open barrels. Cloth was sometimes stretched between poles or over bushes to catch dew and rain alike, especially in monastic gardens and isolated farms. Water wasn't just gathered, it was shepherded, like a nervous animal. You shuffle barefoot through the mud, setting up smaller bowls near the edges of your hut where water drips in thick, steady rhythms. You place pebbles in the bottom of each to keep bugs and leaves from floating too much. The old folk taught you that trick. Adds a bit of filtration and keeps things from spoiling too fast. Out in the meadow, you check your dew traps from earlier in the day. Just before sunset, you laid out sheets of coarse linen over the grass, staked low and flat. Now they're soaked through. You lift one corner carefully, funneling the water into a clay jug. It's slow going, and you'll lose some along the way, but it's better than waiting for a spring to appear out of nowhere. Here's your quirky fringe fact. Some medieval herders would dig shallow pits in fog-prone areas and line them with stone and ash, letting dew and mist condense overnight. The resulting water wasn't clean by modern standards, but it was often enough to keep livestock hydrated. In especially dry seasons, people would even drink it themselves, after filtering through cloth and boiling it, if they could spare the wood. You've also got a handful of makeshift leaf bowls out, a trick you learned from watching deer. Broad leaves cupped into stone hollows where water naturally collects. You've reinforced a few with birch bark strips bound with pitch to hold their shape. They're crude. They work. There's still debate among historians about just how much water medieval people could gather this way. Some say these methods were too inefficient to matter much. Supplements, not solutions. Others argue that in drier regions or for isolated travellers, these techniques meant the difference between another day and another grave. You've lived the question, and your answer is, it depends. If you start before you're desperate, and you learn the land, and you're willing to get your knees dirty every morning, you'll get by. You step under a tree and tilt your head back. The rain has gone from steady to intermittent, a soft mist hanging in the air now. You check your cloth funnels. 2 of them are sagging, weighed down by pooled water. You grab your ladle, a repurposed horn with a carved handle, and scoop the rain into jugs, one careful pour at a time. Back inside, you set your gathered water near the fire to settle. Tomorrow you'll filter it. First through coarse cloth, then through layers of gravel and charcoal in your slow drip setup. A clay pot with holes you drilled with a hot nail and too much patience. It's not perfect. But after years of practice, you can make muddy puddle water taste like something you might actually want to live for. And here's something the manuals never mention. Catching rain isn't just practical, it's meditative. You're not running, you're not fighting, you're waiting, watching, learning the rhythm of the clouds. It slows you down in the best way, makes you feel connected to the land, not just stranded on it. You sip from a jug, just one cautious taste, unfiltered, unboiled. You know it's risky, but you also know where it came from. Off the thatch, through a stone groove you carved yourself, into a jug you fired in last summer's clay oven. It's cold, clean, and tastes like sky. Modern preppers often obsess over gear. Filters, tablets, UV pens, metal straws. And sure, all that stuff works, until it breaks, or runs out, or gets lost in the panic of bugging out. But you? You've got cloth, leaves, stones, ash, and time, and if it rains, you win. You check your dew traps one last time before bed. Damp again. Just enough to top off a flask. You fold them carefully, hang them over a rope to dry, and step back into your hut. Rain's still tapping like an old friend at the door. Inside, the fire crackles. The jugs line up in a row like soldiers, and your body aches in that quiet, useful way. You fall asleep knowing that tomorrow you won't die of thirst, that the sky, for once, was generous. And you remember, while the world tries to out-engineer nature, you've learned to work with it, one drop at a time. Your hands tremble as you thread the last length of horsehair through the eye of your bone needle. The fire's low, casting flickers against the wall, and the cut on your thigh is still oozing slowly, staining your only pair of halfway decent leggings. You could leave it, let it scab over, hope for the best, but you know better. This one's deep, messy, and gaping like the mouth of something that wants to eat you from the inside out. It needs to be closed. Tonight's not about patience or bravery or pain tolerance. Tonight is about stitching wounds with horsehair, a medieval survival technique you never wanted to need, but you're glad you know. You rinse the cut again with boiled water and a splash of vinegar. It stings so badly your vision blurs. You take a long breath, press a folded cloth between your teeth, and prepare to put yourself back together with the tools of a stable boy and the nerves of a lunatic. Here's your historical fact. Horsehair sutures were common in medieval medicine. Sterile technique as we know it today didn't exist, but boiling the hair and rubbing it with oil or alcohol was standard. Horsehair was strong, flexible, and threaded easily through bone or metal needles. Monks used it. Battlefield surgeons swore by it. It wasn't pretty, but it worked. You'd already prepped the hair, plucked it from your old mare's tail last summer when she passed, boiled it in ash water, dried it, stored it wrapped in clean linen for just such a moment. You never thought that moment would be now, in the flickering silence of your hut, with your leg flayed open on a bloody piece of cloth, and your hands shaking like twigs in a storm. You press your fingers around the wound, pinch the skin together and push the needle in. It resists at first, then gives with a sickening little pop. You keep going, through and through, one stitch, then another. By the third pass, you stop noticing the pain and start noticing the blood slowing. That's the real trick. Not stopping the hurt, just outrunning it. You remember watching The Village Healer when you were a child. An old man with a bent spine and a voice like a tired crow. He stitched up a shepherd once right in the middle of the road, crowd gathering, the man screaming as the thread went through his belly. If it scars, the old healer had said, you get to live long enough to care about how it looks. Here's your fringe fact. In some corners of the medieval world, certain wounds were sealed with a paste of crushed insects or fungus. Yes, fungus, after stitching, in place of modern antiseptic. Some species of mould contained naturally occurring antibiotics centuries before we had names for them. You've used mouldy bread once or twice yourself, packed into a wound with a prayer and a grunt. Sometimes it works. Sometimes it smells so bad you assume it's eating you alive. You tie off the last stitch with a loop of trembling fingers, then press a cloth soaked in vinegar and crushed sage over the area. It burns. Good. That means something's still working. You bind it tight with a clean strip of wool, then sit back and breathe, dizzy and cold, but alive. There's an open debate among historians about how effective these suture methods were. Some argue they saved lives just as often as they ended them, with crude tools and filthy hands making things worse. Others point out that the survival rate, especially under the care of experienced healers, was surprisingly high. You fall somewhere in the middle. Skill matters. So does luck. So does your immune system and how much food you've got in your belly to rebuild what you just lost. You hobble to the fire, boil another pot of water, and drop in some yarrow and willow. Bark. Your version of a painkiller. It's bitter, foul, and takes a while to kick in, but it'll numb the worst of it. You sip it slowly, letting the steam fill your nose and lungs, fighting off the wave of nausea that always comes after a bloodletting, accidental or otherwise. In the rafters, a strip of rabbit hide flutters slightly in the updraft. You glance at your tools, bone needle, horsehair spool, vinegar bottle, and think about how few people would be able to do this. How many would freeze? How many would bleed out waiting for someone else to save them? That's the thing no one tells you about medieval survival. It's not about being fearless. It's about doing what needs to be done while terrified, while sweating, while shaking. You don't get applause, you just get another day, and another scar to explain, if you ever decide to tell the story. You remember a traveller who passed through once, all swagger and charm, bragging about how his kit had gold-tipped medical tools and silver needles. You asked him if he knew how to stitch with a bent bone and the tail hair of a horse. He laughed. You didn't. He left the next morning. You never saw him again. Modern preppers have first aid kits the size of dinner plates, packed with antiseptics, bandages, gauze, gloves, trauma shears, and that's smart. But ask them what to do when it's all used up, when the bandages are gone and the pills are empty. Ask them what they'll sew a wound with when the store's closed for good. You already know. The fire pops, breaking the silence. You lean back, leg throbbing, a bit of blood seeping through the wool. You'll change the dressing tomorrow. For now, you let the pain dull into something you can breathe through, and you sleep because you earned it. The first thing you hear in the morning isn't the birds or the wind or the fire wheezing out its last embers. It's a song, your own voice, low and half asleep, mumbling a tune older than your name. You didn't even know you were singing it until the last line faded into the rafters. That's how it goes out here. Songs slip into your mouth like prayers or habits or maps. And that's exactly what this one is. A map. A memory map. Because in the medieval world, when ink was rare and parchment rarer, people used rhythm and rhyme to survive. Today, we're talking about walking songs and memory maps, and how you can carry entire landscapes in your head, if you sing them the right way. You sit up slowly, leg aching from the night before, but stitched and sealed, holding together like a patched roof. You hum the tune again, letting the words roll back into your head. 2 hills past the willow tree, turn your back, count stones to 3. That's not poetry, that's directions. Your grandmother taught it to you before she passed. One of dozens. The songs weren't about pretty melodies, they were practical. They told you where to find shelter, which plants were safe to eat, where the wolf dens were, and which stones to avoid during the thaw. You step outside, limping slightly, and look to the horizon. You need to make a trip today, past the old well, across the ridge, toward the iron tree. Not a tree, actually. Just a blackened, lightning-struck stump that everyone calls the iron tree because it's the only thing that doesn't rot in that stretch of land. The path there's tricky, even dangerous if the ground's still wet. But you know the song, so you hum it. Past the stone that looks like bone, stay right where the moss has grown. It guides your feet as surely as a compass, which of course you don't have. Here's your historical fact. Medieval travellers, especially those who couldn't read, used oral maps encoded in song or rhyme to remember directions. These walking songs often included landmarks, seasonal cues, and warnings. In isolated villages and among shepherds, such songs were often passed down for generations, each singer adding local updates as needed. The melodies were simple, the rhythm steady, designed to match your steps and burn themselves into your memory. You pass the fallen birch with the hollow trunk. 2 crows lift off as you approach, squawking their disapproval. When the crows cry near the bend, take the high road to descend. You climb, veer to the right, and sure enough, there's a washed-out patch where the lower path used to be. The song saved your ankle today. You pause at the ridge, catching your breath, and glance out over the forest below. The iron tree stands tall and bleak in the distance, your marker. You check the position of the sun and count your steps from the last verse. 63 to the flat stone, then 20 to the twisted oak, then follow the deer path down to the stream. You sing as you walk. Not for company, not for art, but for memory. Here's your quirky fringe fact. In some oral cultures, memory mapping was so refined that entire trading routes, hundreds of miles, could be encoded in a single chant. Some included elevation changes, weather patterns, even social rules for different villages. It was like Google Maps if Google had a lute and a sheep and no shoes. There's still a debate among scholars about how widespread this practice was. Some claim it was mostly regional, used by nomads, herders, or those without written language. Others argue it was far more common than we realise, especially in a Europe where literacy was often limited to clergy and nobility. After all, Why write something down when you can just sing it forever? You reach the iron tree by mid-afternoon, your legs stiff but serviceable. You kneel, brush aside some leaves, and dig into the earth near its base. The soil here holds cool even in summer, and deep beneath it lies your prize, a sealed pot of salted mushrooms you buried last harvest. You left them here on purpose, knowing future you would need them more than autumn you did. You open the pot and the smell hits. You, earthy, tangy, still good. You tuck it into your satchel and begin the walk home. This time you sing a different tune, one that loops you past the sunstone hill and keeps you clear of the fox den. If the stone glows red, turn your head. The foxes run, but never fed. You hum, letting the rhythm carry you footstep to footstep, word to word. Back home you unpack the pot, set it by the hearth, and wipe your hands clean. You're tired, but not lost. Never lost. You know every root, every bend, every hollow in this forest, because you've sung them, memorized them, lived inside them like stories you tell yourself to stay alive. And here's something else. When your neighbours need directions, they don't ask for maps. They ask you to teach them the song. That's how you pass it on, not with pens, not with parchment, with breath, with steps, with voices layered in dirt and memory. So while modern preppers pin digital maps and carry GPS devices with backup batteries and laminated guides, you hum a tune passed down from a woman who never learned to read, but could navigate 5 counties without once checking the sky. And when the signal dies, when the batteries drain, and the roads no longer have names, your voice will still carry you home. Because memory, when sung, is survival. And survival, when sung, never forgets. There's a small curl of smoke rising in the distance. Not from your fire, not from any known chimney. It's too far off, too thin, too unfamiliar, and it means only one thing: someone else is nearby. That doesn't sit right. You don't get visitors out here, not unless they're lost, or looking for something they shouldn't have. You set your bowl of mushroom broth aside and step outside, instinct humming in your gut. Time to watch, time to listen. Because tonight we're unravelling another overlooked medieval trick of survival. Chimney smoke signals and the art of long-distance messaging without a single word. The trick is, you don't want to make it obvious that you're watching. You crouch low behind a pile of firewood stacked deliberately near the edge of your property, not just to season logs, but to give you cover exactly like this. You squint past the trees. There it is. Thin grey smoke. Steady. Rising in that slow spiralling way that tells you the fire beneath it isn't a cook fire. It's controlled, measured, intentional. See, back in the day, long before smoke meant Instagram-worthy campfire or someone forgot to open the flue, it meant messages. The shape, colour, timing and rhythm of smoke were used to communicate across ridges, valleys and battlefields. You're watching a medieval text message float through the cold air right now, and you're trying to decode it before whoever sent it ends up too close for comfort. Here's your historical fact. Chimney smoke wasn't just a byproduct of warmth, it was a tool. In medieval times, especially in border villages or outposts, smoke was used to send prearranged signals. A single puff might mean all's well, while 2 in quick succession could warn of danger. Long trailing smoke could mark a death, a meeting, or even an invitation. It all depended on who was watching, and who was sending. You go back inside and check your own chimney. You've already kept it banked low, mostly embers, with the damper closed enough to make your smoke thin and pale. Hard to see. That's on purpose. You don't advertise your presence unless you want to. Right now, you don't. But you do have a signal of your own. You take a small pot, one you keep sealed and buried near the hearth for moments exactly like this, and uncover it. Inside is a clump of dried mushrooms and moss soaked in animal fat, with a bit of green wood shavings. When lit, it smokes like a beehive on fire. Thick, black, impossible to miss. You break off a piece the size of your thumb and set it aside. Not to use yet, just to be ready. Here's your fringe fact. In parts of medieval Scandinavia and the British Isles, some border clans and remote shepherd communities used chimney smoke to tell stories of arrivals, deaths, and events before any visitor reached the village. Even bandits used the trick. Some would monitor smoke patterns to decide when homes were empty, or when villagers were occupied at the fields. Smoke wasn't just heat, it was surveillance. You climb to the thatch-covered loft, peeking through a gap where the roof sags just slightly. From this angle you can see the distant smoke more clearly. It's changed. Now it's stopped, only to restart again in a faster rhythm. That's not a cook fire, you're sure of it now. Someone's sending a pattern, maybe a signal to someone further behind the ridge, maybe testing to see if anyone's watching. Well, you are. There's debate among scholars as to how common smoke signalling really was. Some believe it was mostly used by military outposts and major keeps, not small homesteads. Others point out that in places where the view stretched far and wide and voices couldn't travel, smoke was the next best thing. You land somewhere in the middle. You've seen enough to know it's not a legend. It's just another tool, primitive maybe, but just as clever as any carrier pigeon or coded parchment. You decide it's time to respond. Not with a full signal, not yet, but with ambiguity. You shift your chimney stones slightly, change the draft, throw a pinch of dried pine needles into the coals. The result is subtle. Thinner smoke, drifting slightly east now with a faint blue tint. If someone's watching, they'll know someone's home, but they won't know who, or what that means. Ambiguity, after all, is a kind of armour. Back outside, you light a small fire in the secondary pit, the one you keep hidden behind a fallen tree. Just enough flame to dry your boots later, but also enough to play a little game of deception. If someone's counting chimneys or watching your main roof, let them think there are two of you. Or more. You hum a walking song to steady your nerves and think about what to do next. You haven't used a full smoke signal in years. Not since that bad winter when the neighbouring farm caught fire and someone needed help. But you remember the codes, short bursts, long trails, how to stuff wet moss in for thick white plumes, or toss in dried wool for black. Fire was a language, and you still speak it. As the sun dips behind the tree line, the smoke across the valley stops again. Not drifting, not tapering. Gone. Whoever was there has finished their message, or they're on the move. You stay low, quiet, alert. Inside, you hang a cloth over the chimney and bank the fire low again. The room cools, but your gut stays warm with adrenaline. If they're friendly, they'll knock. If they're not, well, they'll have to guess how many people are inside. And if you light your fat-soaked moss bundle, the smoke will tell the next village that someone came poking around who shouldn't have. So while modern preppers rely on radios, emergency flares, satellite messengers, and encrypted phone apps, you've got smoke. Crude? Maybe. But smoke doesn't break when you drop it, doesn't run out of batteries, doesn't forget the code, and best of all, it can lie. Tonight you sleep in shifts, the fire will stay low, the signal will stay unreadable. You'll keep your message to yourself until you decide it's time to speak. Because in the old world, fire was more than warmth. It was voice, it was warning, and when used right, it was power. You wake to the sound of the wind howling like a thing possessed. Low, deep, vibrating through the walls as if the forest itself is trying to speak. Cold has settled in again, this time with claws. It's not frost, it's not snow. It's that kind of biting, bone-drilling cold that makes your breath crackle in your nose and turns every chore into survival. Your fire's dead. You can see your breath in the dark. And today, you're grateful for two things. Your fur-lined helmet and your dung-lined boots. No, it's not glamorous. Yes, it smells a little like a barn fire wrapped in wet leather. But medieval cold didn't care about your pride. It didn't care about Instagram-worthy winter coats or Gore-Tex, anything. It cared about whether your brain would freeze inside your skull before you finished chopping firewood. So you dress like someone who knows exactly what's coming. The boots go on first. They're leather, cracked, worn, repaired a dozen times, and lined with old sheep wool and yes, dried cow dung mixed with hay and cloth. Sounds insane, but you know better. The outer crust creates a natural insulation layer that traps heat and keeps out moisture. The smell? You stopped noticing that 3 winters ago. Next, the helmet. It's not armour, not anymore. It started life as a piece of battlefield gear, iron cap, chainmail fringe. Now it's been repurposed, padded with rabbit fur, leathered over to keep the metal from touching your scalp. You pull it down snug and feel your ears instantly stop screaming. That helmet has kept you alive through sleet, through hail, through that one storm that froze your neighbour's pigs where they stood. You named it once but forgot what it was. Doesn't matter. It's just the helmet now, like it's part of your skull. Here's your historical fact. In the coldest parts of medieval Europe, survival meant layering not just with cloth, but with whatever you could get your hands on. Helmets were often lined with fur or wool during long marches or winter watch duty. Boots were stuffed with hay, straw, or even dried dung to trap heat and to block wind. While aristocrats had fine furs, peasants used what they had, and often used it better. You step outside, the wind punching you square in the face. Your scarf's already iced over from breath alone. You trudge to the woodpile, axe in hand, feeling your fingers complain despite your gloves. It's not the work that's the problem, it's the stillness afterward. The moment you stop moving, the cold starts digging. That's when the dung-lined boots earn their keep. Your toes are still alive, still flexible. No blackened tips this year. Not yet. You toss a few logs into your arms and head back inside. The wind nearly yanks the door out of your hand. You shoulder it shut and stomp the snow off your soles, then feed the fire like it's a hungry wolf. It roars to life again, grateful for the offering. You hold your hands near the flame, not too close, just enough to bring them back from that pins and needles edge, and then you take inventory. You've got a deer hide blanket, 2 wool layers, and that helmet still on your head. No shame in sleeping in your gear. You've done it before. You'll do it again. Because if this cold keeps up, no fire will be enough on its own. Here's your fringe fact. Some medieval villagers would smear their feet with animal fat and ashes before pulling on their socks, if they had socks, then wrap their legs in oiled cloth to keep in warmth. Others lined their homes with dung-based plaster, which not only insulated but hardened to a fire-resistant finish. It smelled awful. It worked beautifully. You rewrap your boots with a second layer of twine, extra security against the chill. Your outer coat is patched sheepskin over linen, heavy enough to resist the wind if you keep it close to your body. Every opening is stuffed with cloth, neck, wrists, ankles. You don't let the air get in. You don't give it a chance to suck the warmth from your blood. There's still debate among historians about how effective these dung and fur layering methods really were. Some argue they were just desperate improvisations. Others suggest they were well-developed survival practices passed down with pride. You don't need the debate. You've stood through storms in both modern gear and medieval garb, and one thing's for sure, natural insulation is no joke when used right. The sun doesn't even bother to show up today. It just loiters behind thick grey clouds, sulking like a drunk monk. You don't need its light, just its warmth, and that's not happening. So you keep moving. That's the real secret. Motion. You chop kindling, mend the roof where the snow's weighing heavy, keep the animals breathing and the coals fed. Inside, you drape your wet gloves over a chair by the fire, flip your cloak inside out so the fur catches more heat, and warm a chunk of salted lard in a pan to smear on your boots again. It helps waterproof the outside, helps trap the heat in. Smells like regret, but it saves your skin. And here's the thing modern survivalists forget. Comfort is a luxury. Warmth is not. You don't get points for looking good when your teeth are rattling out of your head. Out here, in the real cold, the kind that laughs at fancy gear and name brands, survival means stinking like a sheep pen, wearing a helmet in your sleep, and being smart enough to know that cow dung can be a gift. You sip a mug of hot water, hands wrapped tight around the clay. You listen to the wind beating the walls and know it's not done yet. Tomorrow could be worse, but you'll be ready. Because medieval cold doesn't care how tough you are. It cares if you planned ahead, and you did. You're wrapped in fur, padded in dung, and armed with a helmet that could double as a stew pot if things really go south. Not cosy, not clean, but warm. And warm is everything. The snow finally lets up by mid-morning, but the air still hangs thick with silence, the kind that settles in after something violent passes through. You step outside into a white world, every tree glazed in ice, every branch heavy and drooping, the forest hushed like a cathedral of frost. And yet, something feels off. It takes you a moment to notice what's missing. Birdsong. No crows, no sparrows, not even the usual squirrel chatter. That's when you feel it in your gut. You're not alone. You glance toward the edge of the woods, but nothing stirs. No prints in the snow except yours. Still, you trust your instincts more than your eyes. And in this moment, you remember another layer of medieval survival most preppers wouldn't think to pack. Sacred stones and forest codes. The cryptic, carved and carefully placed signals left in the wild. Not for art, but for survival. Because when the world goes quiet, sometimes the land itself whispers back, if you know how to listen. You pull your cloak tighter and head for the old path leading toward the glade, the one where the trees grow too close together and the moss refuses to die. That's where the first marker sits, a flat stone split down the middle, half covered in lichen. You run your fingers over the edges until they catch on the groove, a spiral carved so faintly you wouldn't notice unless you knew it was there. It's not decorative. It's directional. It means circle back, and you do. Here's your historical fact. Throughout medieval Europe, especially in Celtic, Slavic and Norse regions, certain stones were used as silent signposts, carved with runes, symbols, or directional cuts. They marked trails, safe paths, dangerous zones, or even spiritual boundaries. They were often known only to the local community or passed down orally, invisible to outsiders but invaluable to those who understood them. You turn east instead toward a cluster of standing stones near the ridge. There's a legend that says they were placed by giants. You know better. They were put there by desperate people, long ago trying to remember where safety lived. The second stone, short, wide, sunken into the earth, has a slash on its face like a notch from a blade. You know that mark. It means water nearby. You smile. The stream bed just beyond the ridge probably thawed a bit under the sun. You leave a marker of your own on the stone's base. 3 pebbles stacked neatly, a silent message for anyone else who knows the code. Passed safely, still watching. You were taught that by an old trader who used to barter salt and stories in the fall. He said you should never take from the land without leaving a whisper behind. You duck under a bent pine, one that's grown at such an odd angle it looks like someone leaned against it for too long. Another trick. You've bent young saplings like this before, anchored them to rocks to point towards shelters, traps, or stashes. The forest, after enough time, becomes your journal. You don't need to write anything down, you just bend it, mark it, speak through it. Here's your fringe fact. In certain medieval folk traditions, people believed stones and trees could hold memory, that placing your hand on a sacred stone or sitting beneath an old tree could let you receive messages or knowledge left by those who came before. Superstition? Maybe. But if you've ever sat in a place where something terrible or sacred happened, you know what they meant. There's a spot near your camp you never step across, a narrow ring of moss around a stone that always stays dry, even in the heaviest rains. No one told you why it matters. You just feel it. And so, you respect it. In medieval terms, that's called listening to the land, and it's a survival skill no gear list includes. You reach the final marker just before dusk, a shallow hollow between 2 trees, with a pile of flat stones tucked into the crook of a root. You pull one aside and find exactly what you hoped for, a bundle of wrapped dried apples and a pinch of salt sealed in a horn. You left it here last autumn, hidden in plain sight, under the watchful eye of the forest. The mark beside it, a triangle carved into the bark, meant mine for later. And no one touched it, because out here, those marks are sacred. There's still academic debate about how deliberate some of these codes were. Some say they were coincidence or decoration. Others argue they were fully developed communication systems for people who couldn't afford to write anything down. You don't care what side the scholars land on. Out here, those signs save lives. You've followed tree bends to find a lost child once. You've seen someone place a feather in a hollow log to say, "Don't drink the water here." And what do modern preppers use? Trail tape, GPS coordinates, emergency beacons. But all of that needs power, batteries, visibility. It's loud, it's obvious, it's new. You've got silence, stones and muscle memory. No batteries required. You head home as twilight slips between the trees, marking your trail with a stick dragged behind you, a soft furrow in the snow. Just enough to follow back tomorrow, just in case. And as you pass the first spiral stone again, you place one more signal, a cross of twigs on top. It means, I returned. It's safe. For now. Back in your hut, the fire crackles again. your hands warming around a bowl of broth that tastes like quiet and wood smoke. You hum the song from yesterday. Think about the stones, the hidden marks, the land that speaks if you know the words. Because when the world gets loud and scary, survival doesn't come from shouting. It comes from listening. The knock comes just after dark. 3 quick taps, 1 pause, then 2 more. You freeze mid-stir, hand hovering over the pot of stew, senses locking into place like a drawn bowstring. You didn't invite anyone. You didn't expect anyone. And the last time someone knocked like that, it wasn't for a neighbourly chat. So you do what any halfway sensible medieval survivor would do. You don't answer. You wait. The knocking doesn't come again. You step silently to the wall, blow out the lantern, and press your ear to the cold wood. Nothing. No footsteps crunching the snow. No voices. Just wind. But you don't relax. You go into assessment mode. The same one your great-uncle taught you when you were just tall enough to reach the latch. When to run, when to kneel. That's what he called it. The 3-second rule that separates the living from the looted. You listen harder. Still nothing. And then, like muscle memory, you drop to your knees. Not out of fear, not out of prayer. But because that's what the code demands. Kneeling puts you below the window line, below the arrow's arc, below the guessing eyes of anyone watching from the woods. And more importantly, it puts you in the position to run, forward or back depending on what happens next. Here's your historical fact. Medieval villagers often relied on instinctive non-verbal threat responses to danger. Kneeling behind walls, rolling under carts, pressing into hedgerows. These weren't trained reactions. They were taught, passed down in phrases and gestures, in the looks your mother gave you when strangers came through town. Fight wasn't always the first option. Hide, kneel, run, those came first. You belly crawl to the back of the hut where the escape hatch is hidden behind a pile of firewood. You wedge it open just enough to let the cold bite your face and peek out. The moonlight's thin, silver, almost dreamlike. You scan for movement. Nothing. No shapes in the trees, no outlines on the ridge. But still, you feel watched. You press your body against the ground and breathe slow. Your heartbeat thuds in your ears like drums before a siege. You start weighing your options. Stay. Risk a return. Bolt for the woods and sleep in the root cellar a quarter mile out. You have supplies stashed there, enough to last a few days. This is what threat assessment looks like without cameras, drones or alarms. You're the sensor. Your skin is the warning system. Your breath, your heartbeat, the twitch of your foot. Those are the metrics. You replay the knock in your mind. The rhythm. 3. Pause. 2. Could be nothing. Could be a message. Could be a test. You reach for the dagger beneath the floorboard, bone-handled, still sharp though chipped at the edge, and slide it into your belt. You grab the bundled cloak from its hook and shoulder your satchel, just in case. Here's your fringe fact. In parts of medieval Eastern Europe, villagers trained children to read silence the way others read books. A dog not barking? That meant something. A rooster crowing at the wrong hour? Also something. Survival wasn't just about reacting to noise. It was understanding the meaning of quiet. That's a skill no prepper course can truly teach. Back inside, you remain crouched. You don't light a new flame. Instead, you let the fire die and your eyes adjust. You move slowly, quietly, placing a warm stone in your satchel, wrapped in cloth to keep from freezing. You check your hidden flask, the bit of bread in the wall cache. It's habit by now. The go-pack. You've run before. You know what to bring. There's debate among medieval historians about how prepared rural folk really were for sudden threats. Some think they lived in blissful ignorance, focused on farming and prayer. Others say they were hyper-vigilant. Too many bandits, too many taxes, too many wars that never stopped arriving. You side with the latter. No one who lives close to the land trusts peace for very long. You kneel by the door again, just beneath the window, and run through your final choices. If it's a traveller, you'll hear movement soon. Maybe another knock. You can talk through the door. If it's a scout, they won't knock again. They'll just wait, watching for signs of life. A flame, a shadow, a mistake. If it's someone worse, you'll smell them before you hear them. Smoke, alcohol, or worse, nothing at all. The truly dangerous ones don't stink. They wait in the dark, holding their breath. You decide 1 more hour. If nothing happens, you'll unbar the door, but you stay ready to run. You'll kneel until your knees ache, until your thighs cramp. Because this is the position that's kept people alive for centuries, not standing tall, not screaming for help, but low to the earth, listening for footsteps that may never come. You tuck the dagger under your thigh, fingers resting on the hilt. You count your breaths. You whisper to yourself, not yet, not now, wait. And here's something no one wants to admit. Running isn't cowardice. Kneeling isn't surrender. They're both strategy. They're survival. They're what people did before fences and walls and code-locked doors, when everything could be lost in one bad guess. Modern preppers want to build bunkers. You want to know how to vanish. The fire gives one last sigh and dies. You kneel, you wait, and you survive. Dawn creeps in without ceremony, just a slow shift in the dark. The kind of grey that doesn't feel like light, so much as the absence of total night. You're still kneeling when it happens, back against the cold wall, dagger resting across your lap and every joint in your body begging for mercy. You stayed. You waited. And whoever or whatever knocked didn't return. Maybe they were testing the place. Maybe it was just the wind knocking a frozen branch against the frame in a way your nerves twisted into danger. Doesn't matter. You made the right call. Because in the medieval world, survival isn't about heroics. It's about not screwing up when the odds are against you. You stretch slowly, muscles stiff, spine popping. You're exhausted, starving, and your right foot's gone completely numb from crouching so long. Still, you didn't die last night, so you count that as a win. You put a little water over the coals and bring it to a slow boil while chewing on a strip of smoked trout from the stash under the floorboards. It's chewy, salty, and dry as splinters, but it gets the job done. You've got a few tasks ahead today. Mend the fence, check the traps, maybe restock the root cellar if the snow's light enough. But before any of that, you decide it's time to check the perimeter. And for that, you'll use one of your more creative pieces of medieval home security. Welcome to the wonderful world of fake graves and disappearing doors. Tricks of the trade that peasants and outlaws alike once used to confuse, scare off, or trap anyone foolish enough to come snooping. You bundle up, grab your spear, and step outside. The snow has crusted over slightly, giving you just enough surface to walk without sinking too deep. You circle around to the back of your hut, past the pile of firewood, and toward what looks like a small grave, half covered in old leaves and slumped slightly to one side. It's not marked with a name, just a wooden plank poked into the soil. And it's not a grave. Not really. Just a mound of earth, carefully shaped, weighted with a few rocks, and, if you look close, clearly untouched by time or weather. It's bait. Here's your historical fact. In these medieval times, fake graves were sometimes used to deter looters or ward off enemies. Bandits, fearing plague or spirits, would steer clear. In some cases, families faked burials to hide valuables, fleeing under cover of mourning. Others built false markers to trick tax collectors or avoid conscription records. A fresh grave meant death, and death meant stay away. You move to the hollow tree beside it and check inside. Dry. Empty. But you know if someone came snooping, this would be the obvious place to hide, and that's why you leave it untouched. The real entrance? That's hidden. You walk around the hut and kneel beside what looks like a patch of frozen grass against the wall. You brush it aside and feel for the latch. There it is, just a twist of leather looped through a hidden hinge. You pull, and a section of the wall swings inward, revealing a crawl space. This is your disappearing door. When shut, it looks like the rest of the wall. Wattle and daub patched over with moss and straw. It took you weeks to get it just right. It's narrow, uncomfortable, and completely invisible to anyone who doesn't know where to press. Here's your fringe fact. In some medieval homes, especially those near borders or in contested regions, hidden doors and escape tunnels were common features. Wealthier homes had bolt holes behind tapestries. Even modest cottages sometimes included crawl spaces under hearths, disguised behind furniture or loose floorboards. Some even had false walls made of fabric painted to mimic plaster. So real they fooled soldiers during raids. You don't have a tunnel, but you do have a narrow passage that leads under your hut, to a shallow dugout big enough to sit in. You use it when dangers close, and hiding's smarter than fighting. You keep a jug of water and a few crusts down there. You crawl in, check that everything's dry, then back out and reset the latch. You brush the grass back over the seam, invisible again. There's still debate among scholars whether these tricks were common knowledge or just used by outlaws and the paranoid. Some argue that only the rich or the criminally clever had the time and resources to build such elaborate defences. But if they'd ever lived through a real winter with raiders coming down from the hills, they'd know. Everyone gets clever when they're desperate. You step back and look at your hut the way a stranger would. One window, one door, a crooked fence and a little smoke. Nothing remarkable, nothing worth dying over. That's the idea. You've made the place look poor, abandoned even. The real defences aren't obvious. That's the beauty of it. You walk the perimeter one more time and notice a new footprint by the edge of the trees. Just one, partly erased by the wind. It could be a fox, could be something worse. You mark it mentally, decide to set a few noise traps later. Nothing lethal, just bones on string, maybe a tied bundle of rattling cans from old trade stock. Enough to give you warning. And here's the thing, modern preppers forget. Hiding isn't just physical, it's psychological. A fake grave says plague. A false door says nothing here. A perfectly ordinary hut says, move along. You don't need barbed wire when fear and confusion do the work for you. You return inside, warm your fingers near the fire, and make a note to reinforce the inside latch on the back hatch, just in case. The stew's bubbling now, the smell of onions and broth cutting through the chill. You sit down to eat, glancing once at the dagger still lying nearby. You may never need to run. The grave might never fool anyone. The door might never be tested. But if they are, you'll be ready. Because survival doesn't always mean fighting. Sometimes it means vanishing. The dead don't move out here. Not really. Not unless you count the way wind slips through an overgrown cemetery, or how old bones settle when the frost thaws. But even then it's not movement. It's memory. And memory, as you've learned, is its own kind of defence. So tonight, as the wind rises again and you huddle close to your fire with a sharpened stick and a half-frozen heel of bread, you think about the strangest survival trick you ever learned. The one no prepper talks about. How the dead still guard the village. You don't mean ghosts. Not exactly. Not rattling chains or pale faces hovering above your bed. You're talking about burial practices. Intentional, layered, symbolic. The kind where the placement of a body was as strategic as the walls of a castle. Because medieval people, they didn't just bury their dead, they used them. You throw a pine knot into the fire and let the resin crackle. The shadows dance across the ceiling as you close your eyes and recall the burial mounds beyond the ridge. 3 of them, rounded like sleeping beasts. Most folks don't walk near them, not because they believe in curses, but because, in the back of everyone's mind, you don't disturb what lies beneath. Not because it's dangerous, but because it might be watching. Here's your historical fact. Many medieval communities buried their dead not just in cemeteries, but along property lines, crossroads and borders, liminal spaces. It wasn't random. These graves created spiritual boundaries. If someone crossed into your land and passed a grave marked with carved stones or runes, they'd know they were being watched. Sometimes even bandits hesitated, afraid of angry spirits or ancestral vengeance. Superstition? Sure, but superstition works. You've set your own markers around the perimeter. Not actual graves, though 1 or 2 contain animal bones buried ceremonially, but mounds, stones, cross-shaped sticks, things that look old, things that whisper. Someone important died here. Someone who's still paying attention. You even carved a symbol into one of the trees just beyond the line. A pair of crossed circles, a borrowed design from an old monk's book you found ages ago. The symbol means consecrated. Or maybe it means forbidden. You're not sure anymore. But either way it works. People don't linger past that tree. Here's your fringe fact. In some regions of medieval Europe, especially in Slavic and Baltic traditions, families would bury warriors or elders facing outward, toward the forest or the road, so their spirits could guard the home. Some grave goods were chosen not for the dead, but for the living. Iron knives to ward off witches, dog bones to scare away evil, even thorns to catch wandering souls. Entire belief systems were built on the idea that the dead could defend. There's still heated debate about how literal these beliefs were. Were villagers just afraid of ghosts? Or did they view their ancestors as a kind of eternal militia, watchers, guardians, first-line defence against whatever wandered in from the hills? Either way, you know the truth. People behave differently when they think they're being watched, and if a few old mounds and carved stones make someone think twice about robbing your hut, you've already won. You finish your bread and rise, stretching out your back with a wince. Then you grab a lantern and step outside into the dark. The snow's quiet again, powdery and smooth underfoot. You make your way to the nearest marker, a circle of stones around a pine tree. You brush the snow off the top rock and place a small offering, a strip of dried meat, just enough to show respect. You whisper, still watching, just loud enough for the trees to hear. You know it's for your own comfort, but comfort is part of survival. You need routine, ritual, reasons to keep going. And sometimes the best reason is knowing that the people who came before you might still be helping in the quietest ways. You move to the second mound, a larger one set on a slight rise near the edge of your land. There you check the wooden marker, still standing despite last week's storm. You etched a symbol on it that you made up entirely, a spiral surrounded by thorns. It looks ancient. That's enough. Meaning is just a matter of belief, yours or theirs. You place a few dried herbs at the base, wormwood, nettle, a sprig of rue, and move on. You make the same rounds every few nights. It's not superstition. It's maintenance. A reminder that even if you're alone, you're not entirely alone. The markers stand for something. Boundaries, warnings, memory. And if they frighten the right kind of person, that's just a bonus. Modern preppers focus on motion lights and perimeter alarms. They stock ammunition, tripwires, steel doors. That's all well and good. But intimidation, psychological warfare, that's medieval. That's free. And most importantly, it never runs out of batteries. You return to your hut, brush the snow from your shoulders, and latch the door behind you. The fire's still holding a pulse of warmth, just enough to thaw your fingers. You sit, set your boots near the flame, and think of the old stories about knights buried with swords to guard the realm, or children laid to rest under thresholds to protect the home from evil. You used to think that was gruesome. Now you think it's smart, because even in death people wanted to help, and in times like these you'll take all the help you can get. So here you are, 30 stories deep, bundled under your blanket, or maybe just sitting in the dim glow of your phone, eyes heavy, heart a little steadier than it was when you started. You've walked through the long-forgotten corners of medieval survival, one blistered barefoot step at a time. You've boiled leather for soup, crawled through dew-soaked fields to sip water from leaves, patched your own wounds with horsehair and muttered spells to trees pretending not to listen. You've knelt in silence when danger came knocking. You've watched smoke curl like ancient messages into the sky. You've sung your way home through rhythm and rhyme. And maybe, just maybe, you've started to see survival not just as gear and grit, but as memory, as tradition, as instinct buried so deep in your bones that it only wakes when the fire dies and the wolves start circling. That's the thing modern life tries to bury under convenience. It makes survival a brand, a kit, a subscription box. But back then, it was art. It was desperation wrapped in invention. A soup of mud, spit, pig fat and prayer. And despite the plague, the war, the ice, the hunger, people made it through. Not all of them, but enough to carry the story to you. You're part of that chain now. So if you ever find yourself shivering in the dark with no batteries left, no cell signal, and the wind whistling like it knows your name, just remember what you've learned here. Boil the bark, hide behind the stones, hum the song, trust the dung-lined boots, nod to the graves. The forest might feel empty, but it remembers you. Thanks for staying with me through all 30 chapters. I hope you learned something useful, or at least weird enough to whisper to someone during a blackout. Sleep well tonight, wherever you are. Whether you're deep in the city or miles from the nearest light, the past has your back. Now close your eyes, let the embers die down, and dream like a villager with a full belly and a locked door.